The fire was supposed to erase the past. But some secrets refused to burn. The flames swallowed the Whitmore estate in a slow, deliberate crawl. I stood there, soaked in sweat and rain, staring at the inferno. Wood cracked, glass shattered, and smoke clawed its way into the sky, yet the fire seemed quieter than it should have been. Almost respectful, as if the house itself was ready to be consumed. But even as the mansion burned, I knew the truth hadn't died with it. In my shaking hand was a photograph, half-burned, edges curled from the heat. Grandma Maggie sat elegantly on the porch in that photo, but it wasn't her presence that made my stomach twist. It was the man beside her, my father. And they weren't just sitting. They were holding hands. That's when I realized the fire wouldn't save me. It wouldn't save any of us. 3 weeks earlier, they say family gatherings are where memories are made. For the Whitmores, it was where memories were buried. Grandma Maggie was turning 70, and the entire family was summoned to the estate, a place that always felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The estate sat on a hill, looming over the town like a monarch surveying its kingdom. Ivy crept along the stone walls, its roots sinking as deep as the family's secrets. I hadn't planned on staying long, but something felt different this time. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us, waiting, watching. Grandma greeted each of us with that same polished smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. Her silver hair was pulled into a perfect twist, not a strand out of place. She kissed my cheek lightly, her perfume clinging to my skin, too sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "Ethan, darling. You've grown into such a handsome young man," she said, her eyes lingering on me for a beat too long. It wasn't the compliment that unsettled me. It was the way she said it, like I was something she'd built. Inside, the house was alive with laughter, but it felt staged. My father, Thomas, stood by the fireplace, nursing a drink and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Aunt Evelyn flitted between guests, perfect as always. Her husband, Daniel, leaned in too close when he talked to women who weren't his wife. I caught Grandma watching him once, her expression unreadable. The walls felt closer than usual, the house darker despite the bright chandeliers. Family portraits lined the hallway, faces staring back at me, their eyes dull, their smiles forced. One caught my attention. A painting of Grandma Maggie and my late grandfather. But someone else had been painted over. Barely visible beneath the strokes of black paint was the outline of another man's face. Blink. Was that always there? Later that evening, I slipped away from the noise. The West Wing was off limits, an unspoken rule. Family business, they used to say. Tonight, curiosity won. The hallways were colder here. The walls felt too close, as if the house was squeezing in on itself. I passed closed doors, their handles tarnished and cold. One door stood slightly ajar. Inside, Maggie sat at a small desk, reading a letter. The paper trembled in her hand, but her face was calm. She didn't notice me. "If they find out, it's all over." The voice wasn't hers. Daniel's voice, low and sharp, drifted from the shadows. "Control yourself." "You've been careless," Maggie replied, her tone as cold as ice. "Do you regret it?" Daniel asked. Silence. Then Maggie folded the letter carefully, standing up. "Regret is for the weak. And you, Daniel, are far too ambitious for that." I froze, breath caught in my throat. My stomach churned. Daniel stepped into the light, standing too close to her. They didn't speak, but something in their silence screamed louder than words. I stumbled backward, my foot creaking against the old wood. The voices stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The walls groaned and shifted like they were alive. My mind raced back to their conversation. If they find out. Find out what? About them. About something worse. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But then, a cold draft seeped through the cracks in my window. A soft knock echoed from the hall. 3 slow knocks. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The next morning, the family gathered for breakfast, acting as if nothing had happened. The air was thick with forced smiles. Grandma sat at the head of the table, stirring her tea slowly. "Sleep well, Ethan?" she asked without looking up. I forced a smile. Like a rock. She finally met my eyes. "Good. It's important to get your rest. We have a big day ahead." Her smile was too knowing. Too perfect. Then she raised her teacup, and I noticed something strange. A thin, faded scar running along her wrist. Not old but not recent. Had that always been there? I wanted to ask. But something about the way she held that teacup made me stop. Like she was daring me to. That afternoon, I wandered back to the family portraits. The one with the black paint still bothered me. I leaned closer, tracing the outline beneath the strokes. That's when I noticed something else. A faint signature in the corner. Not the artist's name. Daniel. Why would Daniel sign a painting of Grandma and my grandfather? It wasn't the signature that terrified me. It was realizing it wasn't the only one. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. Daniel's name was there, barely visible beneath the dust and faded strokes of black paint. Why would Daniel sign a family portrait of my grandmother and grandfather? My throat tightened, and I traced the faint outline with my finger. The strokes were deliberate, but not meant to be seen. It was as if someone had wanted the signature hidden but couldn't bring themselves to erase it entirely. Or maybe they wanted someone to find it. A cold draft slithered down the hall, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. I suddenly felt watched. Slowly I turned. The hallway. Silent. Ill. But the house wasn't silent. Not really. Somewhere deep in the walls, I thought I heard a door creak. I told myself to walk away, to go back to the others and pretend this meant nothing. But the itch in the back of my mind wouldn't let me. Daniel's signature on that painting was intentional. A breadcrumb left in plain sight. But for who? I moved deeper into the west wing, steps careful on the creaking floorboards. The walls here were lined with more portraits, but these were older, more faded. Some faces had been scratched out completely, others smeared with dark stains. Time hadn't done this, someone had. Then I saw it. Another painting, half shrouded in a dusty white sheet. My hand trembled as I pulled the fabric away. Grandma Maggie again. Younger. Smiling in the same poised, practiced way. Beside her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, leaning into her with a hand resting lightly on her waist. Not my grandfather. In the bottom corner, carved lightly into the paint, was another signature. Miss, my father. Well, that couldn't be right. I stumbled back, the room tilting around me. My father had barely spoken to Grandma all my life. Their relationship cold and distant. But this didn't make sense. A soft creak behind me snapped me back. Ethan. My name, spoken so softly it felt more like a breath than a voice. I spun around. Nothing. Later that night, the house pressed in tighter. Every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of silence. But silence isn't always empty. At exactly 2:13 a.m. I heard it again. 3 soft knocks. Not at my door. From inside the walls. Sleep was impossible. My thoughts churned. Daniel. My father. Both tied to Grandma in ways I didn't understand. There had to be something binding them together. Something more than whispers in the dark. I needed answers. At sunrise, I slipped out of my room and made my way back to the west wing. The door to Grandma's private study was unlocked. That was new. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and something else. Something metallic. The curtains were drawn tightly, casting long shadows across the room. Her desk was immaculate. No stray pens, no scattered notes. Only a single black leather journal sat in the center, perfectly aligned with the desk's edge. I hesitated. Then I opened it. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, so delicate it barely seemed real. But what froze me wasn't the list itself. It was the header written on the first page. Those who belonged to me. I scanned the names. Miss, Daniel, Jacob, Ethan. Name. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until it hurt. Some names had small symbols beside them, circles, stars, and crosses. My father's name had a deep, bold X carved into the page. Daniel's was circled twice. My own name was underlined. I flipped through more pages, desperate for clarity, but the entries grew stranger. Short sentences, half-finished thoughts. Blood is the strongest chain. Some need to be reminded. Daniel forgets too easily. Thomas always resists. Ethan is not ready. I slammed the journal shut, the sound far too loud in the suffocating stillness. Ethan, what are you doing? The voice was sharp but hushed. I turned to see Jacob standing in the doorway. His expression unreadable. How did you? You shouldn't be in here. His eyes flicked to the journal. Put that down. What is this? I demanded, holding up the book. Why is my name in here? Why is any of this? Jacob's jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought he might rip the journal from my hands. But he didn't. He only sighed, shoulders dropping. You don't want to know, Ethan. I think I do. He studied me for a long moment before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. That book. It's not what you think. Then explain it. Jacob shook his head. You're asking the wrong questions. You should be asking why Grandma's letting you find these things. Letting me. He leaned closer. Do you really think Maggie doesn't know where you've been sneaking around? A cold realization settled over me. She wants me to know. Jacob nodded slowly. That's how it starts. Starts. Jacob hesitated, then murmured. She started with my father too. I didn't have time to ask what he meant before the door creaked open. Grandma stood there, smiling softly. Is everything all right, boys? She purred. Her eyes drifted to the journal in my hands. I tightened my grip. Careful, Ethan, she warned, her voice like silk over steel. Not every truth is meant to be known. And then she turned and walked away. What did Jacob mean by she started with my father too? It wasn't the lies that haunted me. It was the truth hiding in plain sight. Jacob's words echoed in my mind. She started with my father too. What did that mean? What had Maggie done to his father? And how was it connected to the journal, the signatures, and the suffocating secrets strangling this family? I barely noticed my hands trembling as I flipped back through Grandma's journal. Every name etched into the paper carried a silent weight, but it was my own, Ethan, that burned the most. She started with my father too. Jacob's father. My uncle. Another victim. Another participant. Or something worse. The house breathed. The Whitmore estate had always felt alive, but now it seemed to pulse with something darker. The wooden floors groaned beneath my feet, and the walls felt too close, like they were listening. I could almost hear the house whispering secrets I wasn't supposed to know. I needed answers. Jacob was gone, vanishing into the depths of the house after his warning. I had nowhere else to turn, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the attic. If there was a place where forgotten things lingered, it was there. A cold, dusty vault of things better left untouched. The door creaked open slowly, revealing stacks of old trunks, faded furniture draped in white sheets, and boxes with labels too worn to read. The air was thick, cold, and unmoving. As I moved cautiously, a glint of metal caught my eye from beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets. Lockbox. Unlike everything else in the room, this box was pristine. No dust, no rust. Its surface gleamed unnaturally, as if it had been polished recently. That was the first sign I wasn't meant to find it. But I opened it anyway. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some black and white, some faded color. All of them were of Grandma Maggie, but never alone. She was with different men. Some I recognized. My father, Daniel, Jacob's father. But others, strangers. In some photos, her hand rested too comfortably on a shoulder. In others, their closeness was undeniable. But it was the last photo that made my blood run cold. Grandma Maggie, smiling in the garden, standing far too close to a man I thought I knew. My grandfather's brother. I had never even considered him part of our family story. He was barely spoken about, dismissed as distant and irrelevant. But here, in this photo, Maggie's fingers curled around his arm with possession. Why was he erased from the family? Why did no one speak of him? Beneath the photos was a letter, folded perfectly. To Maggie. I can't keep this secret much longer. They will find out. He looks too much like me. There was no signature. Fragmented flashback. The image flickered in my mind. Me as a child standing at the top of the stairs, hearing raised voices. My father shouting. Maggie's voice, calm but cold. He will stay silent. Or I will make him. But whose silence? And what was she willing to do? I stumbled back from the box, knocking into an old mirror propped against the attic wall. It wobbled, the reflection shifting, catching something behind me. Movement. I spun around. Nothing. But in the mirror, a figure stood in the far corner of the attic. Motionless. Watching. I turned again, empty space. I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. Downstairs, the house was quieter than before. Too quiet. Voices drifted from the sitting room. Grandma, Maggie, and Daniel. I crept closer, staying in the shadows. You're letting him get too close, Maggie, Daniel hissed. He needs to know, Daniel. It's already begun. What if he finds out about the others? Then he'll understand why it must stay in the family. Daniel didn't respond. The silence stretched, suffocating. You're scared, aren't you? Maggie's tone softened, but it felt more dangerous that way. You should be. Fear keeps us loyal. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. What if fear isn't enough? Maggie's laughter was soft and cruel. Then blood will be. I backed away, my mind spinning. I needed more. Answers. Proof. Grandma's private greenhouse. She was always in there pruning, cutting, destroying before things could bloom. The door was unlocked. The scent hit me first. Not just flowers but something metallic, earthy. Decay masked by sweetness. Rows of roses, all severed at the stem, never allowed to grow. At the center, a small stone bench with carvings on it. Words etched so faintly they could be missed. Here rests what should have never lived. Bent down. The soil beneath the bench had been disturbed recently. My fingers hit something solid. Cold. A small rusted tin box. Inside was a thin gold chain. Locket. I pried it open. Picture of Maggie. And next to her a baby. On the back. Thomas, 1978. But Thomas was born in 1980. Grandma humming in the garden, clipping roses. My father standing by the window, pale and distant. He was never meant to be. Maggie's voice like a lullaby. The locket slipped from my fingers. I wasn't supposed to find this. The walls of the house seemed to close in tighter. Every creak sounded louder. Every shadow seemed to move. I turned to leave but stopped. On the greenhouse wall, words scratched into the glass. She never let them leave. Who was the child in the photo? And what else is buried beneath the estate? Some secrets are buried for a reason. But what terrified me most was realizing not everything stays buried. The soil from the greenhouse still clung to my fingernails. The locket, cold and heavy in my pocket, felt like it weighed more than it should. My mind spiraled around the image of the child in the photograph. A baby labeled Thomas, 1978. But Thomas was born in 1980. Then who was the child? Was it a mistake? Or a deliberate lie? I couldn't shake the feeling that Grandma knew I had been in the greenhouse. That she knew everything. And yet she hadn't stopped me. The mansion had grown colder. Not in temperature but in spirit. The walls seemed tighter. The air heavier. Every sound, footsteps, whispers, doors creaking, echoed longer than it should, as if the house wanted me to hear everything. I found Jacob in the drawing room, staring at the fireplace. The flames barely flickered, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. Jacob, I started, my voice quieter than I intended. He didn't look at me. You said Grandma started with your father too. What did you mean? His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the fire. My father was never meant to stay in this family, he muttered. But Maggie wouldn't let him leave. I moved closer. What do you mean she wouldn't let him leave? Jacob finally turned to me, his eyes dark. You really think Maggie just lets people go? You think it's coincidence how tightly this family clings together? Even when we hate each other. Jacob, what did she do? His lips pressed into a thin line. Then a bitter laugh. You ever wonder why no one talks about my father? I hadn't. Till now. He tried to leave. Tried to take me and my mother with him. But Maggie. She has a way of making people stay. How? Fear. Guilt. Or something worse. He paused. My father didn't make it out. Maggie said it was an accident. But it wasn't. The room seemed to darken around us. What happened to him? I whispered. Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled photograph. He handed it to me without a word. It was a picture of his father. Young, smiling, arm around Grandma Maggie. But something was wrong. His eyes. They weren't smiling. On the back, in faded ink. He belongs to me. The words jolted a memory. Fragmented flashback. A younger me, hiding behind the grand staircase. Grandma's voice floated through the air, soft and deliberate. Family is bound by more than love, Thomas. Blood is stronger. Blood is forever. My father's voice, trembling with restrained anger. You can't control us, Oz. Then Grandma's chilling reply. Oh, but I already do. I snapped back to the present, my breathing shallow. She controlled him too, I muttered. Jacob nodded slowly. She controls us all. One way or another. But why? What does she want? Jacob's expression darkened. It's not about what she wants. It's about what she's afraid of. I stared at him. Afraid of what? He didn't answer. I needed more. More than cryptic warnings and old photos. There had to be something concrete. Proof. I found myself standing outside Maggie's bedroom door. I shouldn't have been there. No one was allowed in her room. Not even the staff. But I wasn't leaving without answers. The door creaked open slowly. Her room was as pristine as the rest of the house. Not a thing out of place. The bed was perfectly made. The curtains drawn tight. Yet the room felt wrong. My eyes caught the large armoire in the corner. Old dark wood. Heavy. Its doors were slightly ajar. Pulled them open. Inside clothes hung neatly. But it was the back panel that caught my attention. Slightly warped. Like it had been moved before. Pushed it. The panel shifted, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a stack of letters, bound with a black ribbon. I untied it carefully. The letters were old. Faded. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Grandma's. To my dearest. They suspect nothing. But I worry. The boy grows restless. He asks too many questions. He looks too much like you. I cannot let him know the truth. Maggie. The letters weren't addressed to anyone. No names. Just my dearest. And then, tucked between the pages, a birth certificate. Name, Thomas Whitmore. Date of birth. February 17, 1978. Mother, Margaret Whitmore. Father. Name omitted. The space for the father's name had been deliberately scratched out. But why? A fleeting image. My father standing in the hallway, clutching a piece of paper, his hands shaking. Grandma's voice, soft but sharp. It's better if you don't know. My father's voice, broken. But he deserves to. A sharp noise snapped me back to reality. The sound of footsteps. Growing closer. I stuffed the letters back into the armoire and slipped out of the room, heart pounding. Down the hall, Maggie stood at the top of the staircase, gazing out of a tall window. Looking for something, Ethan, she asked, not turning around. Froze. No, I lied. She turned slowly, her smile thin and knowing. Be careful where you wander. This house holds memories best left undisturbed. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. And then she was gone. I gripped the birth certificate in my pocket, my mind spinning. Thomas, 1978. Who was his father? Why did Maggie erase him? And what else was she hiding? One thing was certain. I was getting closer. And Maggie knew it. Who was the man Maggie erased from the family's history? And why was she so afraid of him? Some doors should never be opened. But what if they were never meant to stay closed? The house was too quiet. Not the comforting silence of a home, but a suffocating stillness that made every creak of the floor feel like a scream. It was as if the walls themselves knew what I had discovered and were holding their breath, waiting for me to make my next move. The birth certificate in my pocket burned against my skin like a brand. My father's name, Thomas Whitmore, scratched into the paper, but the father's name, a blank void. Someone had made sure it stayed that way. But why? And then there were the letters. He looks too much like you. The words echoed in my head, twisting and knotting into something far darker than I was prepared to face. I couldn't stop now. Not when I was this close. I moved through the house like a shadow, careful and deliberate. Every hallway, every closed door felt heavier than before. The mansion was alive, watching, and I had the sickening feeling that Maggie knew exactly where I was. My fingers traced along the cold walls, guiding me toward something I couldn't explain. I wasn't even sure where I was going until I stopped in front of a door I had never noticed before. It was old more so than the others, with peeling paint and a brass handle dulled by time. A keyhole sat beneath the handle, but the door was slightly ajar. It shouldn't have been. Pushed it open. The room was bathed in shadows, dust particles dancing in the faint light that seeped through the curtains. It was a bedroom but not like the others. The air was thick, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. But it wasn't abandoned. The bed was made, perfectly neat, with a single white rose placed on the pillow. A thick layer of dust coated everything except the rose. It was fresh. On the dresser sat a framed photo turned face down. I hesitated before picking it up and turning it over. It was Maggie. And beside her, a man. The same man from the photograph I had found earlier. The man who was erased from the family portraits. But here they weren't posing for a family picture. They were close, intimate. On the back of the frame, scrawled in faint ink. Mine always. Cold shiver ran down my spine. This room wasn't forgotten. It was preserved. Laughter echoed down the hall, distorted and distant. He can't stay here, Maggie. It's not right. He belongs with me. This isn't love. This is something else. A sharp, heavy silence followed. Then the unmistakable sound of a door locking. I snapped back to the present, breath quick and shallow. This wasn't just a forgotten bedroom. It was a tomb for a memory that wasn't supposed to exist. And Maggie was still keeping it alive. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A small box tucked beneath the nightstand. It was old, wrapped in cracked leather, and sealed with a rusted clasp. I hesitated. Then I opened it. Inside were more photographs, but these were different. These were of Maggie, younger, in places I didn't recognize. Forests, abandoned buildings, isolated cabins. In every photo, a different man stood beside her. On the back of each photo, the same word written in delicate script. Mine. But it wasn't just family members. There were strangers too. Men I didn't recognize. And tucked beneath the photos was something else. A child's drawing. Crude, childish strokes in black crayon. House. Woman. A figure standing beside her, faceless. Above it, written in shaky letters. Mommy and him. My stomach churned. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were almost at the door. You shouldn't be in here, Ethan. Maggie's voice, soft but sharp, cut through the air like a knife. I froze, the box still in my hands. She stood in the doorway, bathed in shadow, her face unreadable. This room. It's not for you, she said, stepping inside slowly. Who was he? I asked, my voice barely steady. The man in the photos. The man you erased. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Some stories are better left untold. Tell me. Long pause. He was family, she whispered, eyes distant. And that was his greatest mistake. Who was he? I demanded. Her gaze darkened. Your grandfather's brother. My breath caught. But why erase him? She tilted her head as if studying me. Because not all family is meant to stay. Some must be forgotten for the rest to survive. What did you do to him? Her smile faded. I kept him close. That's all you need to know. She moved closer and I instinctively took a step back. Be careful, Ethan, she whispered. You're starting to ask the wrong questions. And then softer, almost a caress. Or maybe. You're starting to ask the right ones. The sound of sobbing. Please, Maggie, let me go. You belong to me. A door slamming shut. Maggie turned and left, leaving the door wide open. I was alone in the room, but I didn't feel alone. I had found more than I was ready for. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. What really happened to my grandfather's brother? And why did Maggie keep him hidden from us all? Some people die and are buried. Others are buried long before they die. I couldn't breathe. The mansion felt smaller now, its walls pressing in on me, suffocating me. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls like whispers from ghosts that refused to rest. Maggie's cryptic warning still rattled in my head. Be careful, Ethan. You're starting to ask the wrong questions. But what if I was finally asking the right ones? The photo I found in the forgotten room haunted me, the erased man beside Maggie, now revealed as my grandfather's brother. The man no one spoke of. The man Maggie had wiped from our family's story. But why? The answer had to be somewhere in this house. Somewhere deeper. I thought about the strange noises in the walls. The soft knocks at night. The feeling that someone was always watching. What if it wasn't just in my head? What if the house was hiding more than secrets? I was 8. The house was colder back then, colder than it should have been. I remember hearing footsteps in the walls. It's just the house settling, my father had told me. But houses don't settle with footsteps. And I remember Maggie whispering to me once, some people don't know when to leave, Ethan. So they stay where they're put. The memory slammed into me like a freight train. Maggie hadn't just erased him from the family's story. She had hidden him. In the house. Or worse, beneath it. Driven by a sickening curiosity, I found myself in the cellar. The air was damp, thick with a scent of mold and something else. Metallic like rusted iron. I'd been down here before, but it felt different now. Every shadow seemed to lean closer, every corner darker than it should be. I ran my hand along the stone walls until it stopped on something unnatural. A thin, almost invisible seam in the stone. Door. But not a normal one. A hidden panel, carved to blend perfectly into the wall. Pushed. It didn't move. I pressed harder. Click. The wall shifted, creaking open into darkness. A narrow staircase spiraled downwards, swallowed by shadows. The air grew colder with each step, like I was descending into the earth itself. At the bottom was another door, this one metal, with deep scratches gouged into it. Scratches made by nails. Someone had tried to claw their way out. My hand trembled as I turned the handle. It wasn't locked. The door groaned open, revealing a small, windowless room. No, not a room. Prison. The walls were bare stone, stained and cracked. A rusted bed frame sat in the corner, its mattress rotted away. Chains hung limply from the wall. And on the opposite wall, something was carved deep into the stone. Still here. I backed away, breath catching in my throat. But then I saw it. A figure in the corner. Ill. Motionless. Watching. Who's there? My voice cracked. Silence. Then slowly, the figure stepped forward, into the pale shaft of light seeping through the open door. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man. Or what was left of one. Thin. Hollow-eyed. Skin like paper stretched over bone. He didn't speak. He just stared. And then he smiled. You look just like him, he rasped. I couldn't move. Who are you? Forced out. His smile widened, showing broken, yellowed teeth. Family. Laughter behind closed doors. A man's voice, muffled and pleading. Please, Maggie. Let me go. Her voice soft and chilling. You belong to me. You always have. What did she do to you? I asked, voice barely a whisper. He tilted his head. She forgot about me. Just like she will forget you. A shiver tore through me. How long have you been down here? He chuckled, dry and brittle. Time doesn't exist here. Only Maggie does. I took a step back. Why did she keep you here? His eyes darkened. Because I knew the truth. What truth? He leaned closer, his breath rattling. That this family is hers. And she'll do anything to keep it that way. I turned to run, but his hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Don't trust her, he hissed. Not even when she tells you the truth. Especially not then. I yanked free and bolted up the stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping him in the dark once more. I didn't stop running until I was back in the light of the main house. My chest heaved, sweat clinging to my skin. I wasn't imagining the footsteps in the walls. Knocks. The cold draft. There was someone, something, trapped beneath this house. And Maggie had put him there. But why? What truth was so dangerous it had to be buried alive? As I leaned against the wall, catching my breath, I noticed something. The family portrait in the hallway. The one I had stared at countless times. Maggie, my grandfather, my father as a boy. But this time something was different. In the reflection of the glass, another figure stood in the background. Faint, blurred, butching, turned. No one was there. But in the glass he was still watching me. What was the truth so dangerous that Maggie locked him away? And how much longer can it stay hidden? Every truth has a price. I just didn't realize how high mine would be. The walls weren't just hiding secrets, they were suffocating in them. My skin still crawled from the feel of that man's cold grip. His breath like dust in the air. His words echoed louder in my mind than they had in that dark room. Don't trust her. Not even when she tells you the truth. Especially not then. But how do you fight someone who has rewritten every truth you've ever known? I gripped the railing as I climbed the stairs back to the main floor. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself wanted me to stay in its depths. I couldn't tell if the cold sweat on my skin was from fear or from the terrible realization growing inside me. Grandma Maggie wasn't just the puppet master of this family. She was its architect, and maybe its destroyer. The hallway felt longer than usual, dimly lit, silent, except for the ticking. The grandfather clock at the end of the hall was louder than it had ever been. Each second snapped through the air like a whip. But as I passed it, I realized it wasn't ticking in rhythm. It was knocking. Low. Deliberate. I paused, heart hammering in my chest. Whoa. It was coming from inside the clock. I swallowed hard and reached for the glass door. It groaned as it swung open. Inside, instead of gears and pendulums, there was a folded piece of paper wedged between the clock's workings. Pulled it free. Note. Handwritten in thin, delicate script. He is not the first. You won't be the last. She always wins. No signature. But the handwriting. It wasn't Maggie's. I was 5. Playing with wooden blocks in the study. Maggie knelt beside me, brushing my hair back. Families must stay close, Ethan. That's how we stay strong. But why don't we see Uncle Henry? Her smile faltered for just a second. Some family forgets how important that is. They drift away. She leaned closer. But they always come back. I crumpled the note in my fist. Uncle Henry. My grandfather's brother. The man in the walls. But who left the note? And why now? My thoughts spun wildly until a noise pulled me back. Voices, low and sharp, coming from behind the parlor doors, crept closer. We can't keep this up, Maggie. Daniel's voice. Trained. Angry. You think we have a choice? Maggie's voice, calm but sharp. He's digging too deep. Like his father. And look what happened to Thomas. Was heavy, dangerous. Exactly. Maggie's voice dropped to a whisper. We cannot let Ethan ruin everything. My breath caught in my throat. Then what do you suggest? Daniel's tone cracked. The same thing I did to Thomas. Cold. Final. I stumbled back, the floor creaking beneath me. Silence from the room. Did they hear that? My heart pounded as I backed away, slipping into the shadows of the hall. I didn't wait to find out. I fled to my father's old study. It had been sealed for years. Maggie never allowed anyone inside after my father left. But tonight I didn't care. The door wasn't even locked. Dust coated every surface. Papers yellowed with age. But one thing stood out. Locked drawer. I searched the desk for a key, fingers trembling. Nothing. In frustration I yanked on the drawer. It didn't budge. Until it did. The drawer flew open, revealing a single, worn notebook. My father's handwriting. I flipped through the pages, eyes scanning his frantic, uneven script. She knows I'm onto her. She's been watching me. Just like she watched him. Like she watches us all. The man in the walls isn't dead. He's waiting. And now she's waiting for me to join him. My father pacing in this very room, muttering to himself. You don't understand, Evelyn. She's done this before. Aunt Evelyn's voice shaking. You're scaring me, Thomas. You should be scared. Then silence. Followed by the sound of the door locking. I turned to the final page. If you're reading this, Ethan, it means she's won. But you can still stop her. Find the key. No explanation. No clue. The key to what? My eyes darted around the room. The bookshelves. The paintings. Desk. And then I saw it. A small, ornate key pinned behind the frame of our family portrait. Hidden but not well enough. Pried it free. But what did it unlock? A noise behind me. It spun. Maggie stood in the doorway. Her smile was thin. Your father was always too curious. Just like you. What did you do to him? I hissed. Her smile didn't waver. I protected him from himself. Just like I'll protect you. Her eyes flicked to the key in my hand. But you've made things difficult. The light in the room seemed to flicker. Be careful where that key takes you, Ethan. Some doors should stay locked. And then she was gone. I knew where it had to go. The east wing. The one section of the house that was always locked, always off limits. Heart pounding, I crept down the dark hallway until I reached the heavy oak door at the end. The key slid in perfectly. Blick. The door groaned open. Beyond it was darkness. And the cold smell of damp earth. I stepped inside. The door shut behind me. Some doors are locked for a reason. I should have known opening this one would change everything. The key turned with a slow, deliberate click. The sound felt louder than it should have, echoing down the dark corridor. I hesitated, my hand frozen on the handle. Behind this door lay more than just answers. It was a boundary Maggie never intended to be crossed. But if she thought locking it would stop me, she didn't know me as well as she thought. I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. Cold air seeped through the crack, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something else, metallic and sharp. Blood. I swallowed hard and descended. The walls closed in as I moved deeper underground. The flickering light from my phone cast long, thin shadows that danced on the stone walls. At the bottom, the passage split in two. One path was sealed with a rusted iron gate. The other led into darkness. And then I saw it. A smear of red on the wall, faint but deliberate. Handprint. Fresh. A muffled argument from years ago. You locked him down there. My father's voice, sharp with disbelief. Maggie calm but firm. He wanted to leave. I made sure he couldn't. You're insane. Soft laughter. No, Thomas. I'm practical. I followed the handprint. The tunnel narrowed until it opened into a vast chamber. This wasn't just a basement. This was something else. Old stone pillars lined the walls, and on each one names were etched. Dozens of them. Family names. Thomas, Daniel, Henry, Jacob. My name wasn't there. In the center of the room was a table. On it sat an old dust-covered box. The same design as the one I'd found in the attic. But this one wasn't locked. Opened it. Inside were photographs. All of Maggie. But each photo was of her with a different man. Not family. Not anyone I recognized. In every photo she wore the same smile. The same cold, possessive gaze. And beneath the photos, a single folded letter. To the one who dares to know. My hands trembled as I opened it. They were never enough. Not one of them. But you might be. No signature. But I knew who wrote it. Sound behind me. A step. Low. Measured. I spun around, heart pounding. The figure stepped into the light. It was Daniel. But something was wrong. His face was pale, eyes dark, sunken. Ethan, he whispered, voice barely audible. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing. He didn't answer. His eyes darted to the box in my hands. You shouldn't have opened that. Why not? What is this place? Daniel took a shaky breath. It's where she keeps the things she doesn't want to forget. Or forgive. Forgive what? Daniel's face tightened. Her mistakes. Daniel's voice distant. Maggie, this is wrong. You owe me loyalty, Daniel. After everything I've done for you. This isn't loyalty. This is control. Call it what you want. You're still mine. Daniel's hands trembled. You need to leave, Ethan. Oh. Not until I understand what's happening. His eyes darkened. Understanding won't save you. It didn't save your father. The words hit like a punch to the chest. What did you say? Daniel swallowed hard, his voice breaking. Thomas tried to stop her. He thought he could fix this family. But you can't fix something that was born broken. What did she do to him? Silence. Then, in a whisper so low I barely heard it. She made him forget. Forget what? I demanded. Daniel took a step back, shaking his head. All of it. Who he was. What she did. What he did. I gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. What did he do, Daniel? Daniel's eyes glistened. He helped her. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt. My father helped Maggie. Whoa. He couldn't have. Whoa. He hated her. Daniel cut me off. Before he hated her, he loved her. The air left my lungs. Whoa. You're lying. Am I? Daniel's face twisted into something between pity and disgust. Why do you think she was so obsessed with him? Why do you think she couldn't let him go? Maggie's hand resting on my father's shoulder during family dinners. Little too long. A little too familiar. My father pulling away sharply, his face pale. Her soft, knowing smile. Blood is thicker than water, Thomas. And you're drowning. My vision blurred. What did she make him forget? Daniel's eyes flicked to the far wall. That he wasn't the first. My knees almost buckled. Not the first what? Daniel's gaze bore into me. To love her. The room spun. I clutched the edge of the table to steady myself. No. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. And you won't be the last. A sound echoed through the chamber. Soft, deliberate click. Turn slowly. Maggie stood at the top of the stairs, bathed in shadow. Her smile was razor thin. I wondered how long it would take you to find this place. Her eyes glinted. But it seems I underestimated how much like him you really are. They say memory fades with time, but in this family, forgetting was forced. Her eyes were colder than the stone walls surrounding us. You're more like him than I realized. Grandma Maggie's voice barely echoed, yet every word pressed against me like a weight. What did you make him forget? I demanded, my voice cutting through the still air. She tilted her head, the faintest smile on her lips. Everything that mattered. Before I could speak, she turned and disappeared into the shadows. The chamber seemed darker now. Daniel hadn't moved, standing stiff and pale. His eyes distant. What did she mean? Asked him. He didn't meet my gaze. Your father didn't just uncover her secrets, Ethan. He became part of them. Explain, I snapped, my patience gone. Daniel sighed, running a shaky hand through his hair. She made him believe it was all his fault. That everything, the affairs, the lies, the betrayals, started with him. But it didn't. Daniel shook his head slowly. Oh. But she convinced him it did. How? Daniel's face darkened. With something he could never deny. My father pacing in his study, clutching a letter. His knuckles white, his breathing ragged. No. No, this can't be true. Maggie's voice, soft but firm. But it is. And now you understand why it must stay in the family. The sound of something shattering. What did she show him? Pressed. Daniel hesitated. Then, slowly, he raised a trembling hand and pointed across the chamber. To a second locked door. A door I hadn't noticed before. The answers are in there. The door was heavier than the first, cold metal biting into my palms as I pushed. It opened into a small, dimly lit room. And there, on a dusty pedestal, sat a single black journal. My father's. I approached slowly, my breath shallow. The journal felt heavier than it should have, like it was pulling me down with it. Opened it. The first page was simple. I remember now. Page after page was filled with frantic handwriting. Maggie said it wasn't wrong because it was love. But love shouldn't feel like this. She made me think it was my idea. That I wanted it. But I didn't. I didn't, did I? The words blurred as my vision swam. Oh, this couldn't be real. But deep down I knew it was. Maggie leaning close to my father, a hand resting lightly on his knee. No one understands you like I do, Thomas. His face pale, conflicted. This isn't right. Her voice softened, silk hiding steel. Feels right. That's all that matters. I turned the page. She told me we were the same. That our blood made it right. But now I see the truth. It was never about love. It was about control. The words were smudged, as if his hand had shaken while writing. Beneath that, a name. Henry. Your grandfather's brother. Daniel murmured behind me. She did the same to him. My hands trembled. And now she's trying to do it to me. Daniel's silence was answer enough. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. We need to leave, I whispered, slamming the journal shut. But Daniel didn't move. His face was pale, frozen in fear. She won't let us. I followed his gaze. Maggie stood in the doorway, calm and composed. Why run, Ethan, she purred. You've come so far. Her eyes flicked to the journal in my hands. Did you find what you were looking for? I tightened my grip. Why? My voice cracked. Why did you do this to him? To Henry. Her smile was slow, deliberate. Because they were weak. She took a step forward. And I needed them to be strong. Maggie tending to roses in the garden. Sometimes you must prune the weak stems so the strong ones can flourish. She snipped a perfect rose from its stem, letting it fall to the ground. It's the only way to grow. You think this is strength? Back. Breaking people. Her eyes darkened. No, Ethan. Strength is accepting what must be done for the family. She stepped closer, voice softening. And now it's your turn. No. Her smile faded. You don't have a choice. Daniel lunged, grabbing my arm. Run. We bolted past her, the journal clutched to my chest. Her laughter followed us, cold and hollow. Run as far as you like, Ethan. But blood always finds its way home. We burst into the main hall, breathless. We have to leave this house, I gasped. Daniel shook his head. It's not the house. It's her. I stared at him. Then how do we stop her? Daniel's expression was grim. We remember what she made us forget. Some voices aren't meant to be heard, and some memories aren't meant to be remembered. The mansion groaned as if it were alive, exhaling in the cold silence that wrapped around it like a shroud. Every step I took echoed too loudly in the long, narrow hallways, as though the house itself was listening, watching, waiting. But it wasn't the house I feared anymore. It was what it was built to protect. What Maggie was trying to protect. Daniel and I stood in the dimly lit study, the old journal clenched in my hands. My father's words burned into my mind, each line heavier than the last. She made me forget. But forget what? There has to be more, I muttered. Daniel's eyes, shadowed and wary, flicked toward the door as though expecting Maggie to appear at any moment. You don't know when to stop, do you? He muttered. If I stop now, I'll end up like my father, I shot back. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. The journal wasn't finished. Pages were missing, ripped cleanly out. Someone didn't want me to read them. But why tear them out if Maggie had already manipulated my father? There has to be another copy. My voice was barely a whisper. Daniel didn't move. If there is, it would be in the old library. My stomach dropped. The one in the east wing. Daniel gave a slow, grim nod. That part of the house was closed off after your father left. His voice faltered. Well, after Maggie made him leave. Then that's where I'm going. The east wing was the coldest part of the house. Its halls hadn't been walked in years. Dust layered every surface like a burial shroud, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the high, vaulted ceilings. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten memories. At the end of the hall stood the library doors, tall and heavy oak, carved with intricate patterns long faded. I hesitated, then pushed. The doors groaned open, revealing a cathedral of books. Shelves stretched to the ceiling, casting long shadows that merged into the dark corners. But something was wrong. The silence wasn't empty. It was watchful. As I moved deeper into the library, my eyes scanned the shelves, searching for anything out of place. Then I saw it. Gap. A single book missing from a perfectly organized row. I reached up and ran my hand along the dusty spines. The space was deliberate. I knelt to the floor, searching for any sign of the missing book. That's when I saw the faint scratch marks on the floor, circling the base of the shelf. Had been moved. Recently. I pressed my shoulder into the side of the shelf and pushed. It didn't budge. I pushed harder. Click. The shelf shifted, revealing a narrow stone passageway descending into darkness. How many hidden doors does this house have? I muttered under my breath. I didn't wait. I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each step. The passageway led to a small, circular room. In the center a single pedestal, and on it a book, bound in worn leather, its cover unmarked. I approached cautiously, opened it. It wasn't a book. It was a ledger, family record, but not the kind you display in family portraits. Every page listed names. And next to each name a symbol. Some were circled, some crossed out. My father's name, Thomas Whitmore, was circled in red. But there was another name I didn't recognize. Evelyn Whitmore, circled twice. And below it a single word. Forgotten. A woman's soft laughter, echoing down the halls. Maggie, this isn't right. It's family, Evelyn. That makes it right. No, it doesn't. Was. Then you'll need to forget. Evelyn Whitmore. I whispered. Daniel's voice behind me was hollow. Your aunt. I turned sharply. I don't have an aunt. Daniel's face was pale. Exactly. What happened to her? Daniel swallowed hard. She found out too much. And Maggie. Made her forget. Then made us forget. I stared at the ledger. She erased her from the family. Daniel didn't respond. Because the answer was clear. My hands shook as I turned the page. More names. More symbols. At the very end, a name I recognized. Ethan Whitmore. My own. Circled. Once. Then underlined. And beneath it, in delicate handwriting. Next. A sound echoed through the stone room. A step. Low. Deliberate. Daniel's eyes widened. She's coming. We didn't have time to run. The only way out was the passage behind us. But the footsteps didn't come from behind. They were ahead. From deeper in the stone walls. A soft voice drifted toward us. "You should have stayed where you belonged, Maggie." But the voice wasn't coming from the hall. It was coming from the walls themselves. Soft humming. Lullaby. The walls shaking as if breathing. "Families must stay close, Ethan. That's how we stay safe." Daniel grabbed my arm. "We need to move." But I couldn't move. Name. Written in Maggie's hand. Next. I closed the ledger and turned to Daniel. "Whoa. We finished this. It's not what Maggie did to Evelyn that terrifies me. It's why we forgot her at all." The name Evelyn Whitmore rattled in my mind like a distant echo, faint but persistent. How could I forget someone I never knew existed? Daniel's silence lingered in the cold air, heavier than the darkness pressing in around us. The ledger sat closed on the pedestal, but its weight hadn't left my hands. "She made us forget Evelyn." Daniel's jaw tightened. "She didn't just make us forget. She erased her." The words didn't make sense. People don't just disappear from memory. Unless someone forces them to. We left the hidden chamber, moving cautiously back into the library. Every creak of the wooden floor seemed deafening. Maggie could be anywhere now. What did Evelyn do to deserve this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes were distant, as if trapped in memories he couldn't fully grasp. "She was the first to fight back." "Fight back how?" Daniel swallowed hard. "By remembering." A woman's soft, angry voice. "I won't let you control me, Maggie." Maggie's voice, calm and chilling. "Then you leave me no choice." The sound of something breaking. Daniel's words churned in my mind. If Evelyn was the first to resist Maggie's control, what had she uncovered that threatened Maggie so deeply? "There has to be something left of Evelyn," I said. "Some proof she was real." Daniel hesitated. "There might be." "Where?" He sighed, defeated. "The attic." The attic was a tomb of the past. Dust thick enough to coat every surface. Old trunks sealed with rusted locks. Family portraits draped in white sheets, hiding faces long forgotten. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my chest. Daniel moved toward an old wardrobe. His steps slow and careful. If anything survived Maggie's purge, it would be in here. The wardrobe creaked open, revealing nothing but moth-eaten coats. But Daniel reached past them, feeling along the back panel. Click. A small compartment swung open. Inside was a single item, a cracked leather-bound diary. On the cover, embossed in fading gold, E.W. My hands trembled as I took it. The pages were brittle, but the writing was bold and sharp. "She watches me, even in my sleep. She thinks I don't know what she's done, but I remember. I don't. But I do." I turned the page. Daniel comes to me in tears, but he doesn't know why. Thomas avoids me like I'm diseased. They think I'm the problem. But Maggie is the sickness. The ink grew erratic, the handwriting jagged. "She told me if I speak, I'll be silenced. If I run, I'll be lost. But I won't let her erase me. Not like Henry. Not like the others." The final entry chilled me to the bone. "Tonight I confront her. If this is found, know I fought. Remember. And that is my curse." The page was torn at the corner, stained with something dark, something old. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew exactly what Maggie was doing." Daniel's face was pale. "And she paid for it." A sudden noise cracked through the attic, the sound of wood splintering. I turned sharply. A section of the floor had shifted. No, it was a door. Hidden trapdoor. Daniel stared at it, wide-eyed. That wasn't open before. Slowly I approached the trapdoor. Dust fell from its edges as if it hadn't been touched in years. Pulled it open. The air that rose was colder than ice, sharp and suffocating. A narrow staircase spiraled down into the dark. Daniel's voice shook. "This wasn't here before." I grabbed the lantern from the corner, lighting it with trembling hands. "We need to know what's down there." He didn't argue. We descended. The The stairs led to a hidden corridor, carved into the stone foundation. The walls were damp, covered in faded etchings. And then we saw it. Small iron door. No handle. No lock. Just a single word, scratched deeply into the metal. Evelyn. Daniel froze. She's here. I pressed my hand to the cold metal. And then a sound came from the other side. Breathing. I staggered back. Whoa. That's impossible. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. It's not. The breathing continued, ragged and slow. Pounded on the door. Evelyn. Shouted. No response. Just breathing. We have to open it. Daniel shook his head violently. No, Ethan. Maggie locked this for a reason. I glared at him. So we're going to let her die in there. Daniel hesitated. What if that's what Maggie wants? Maggie's voice soft as silk. Some things are meant to stay hidden. Like Evelyn. Cold laugh. Like what Evelyn became. I gritted my teeth. Give me the lantern. Daniel handed it over, his hands shaking. Slowly, I pressed it against the door, illuminating the carvings. Symbols. Strange and twisting. Not words. Not language. But warnings. And one final message scratched beneath Evelyn's name. She remembers. The breathing grew louder. Faster. More ragged. Daniel backed away. We need to go. But I didn't move. Because the breathing wasn't human. Not anymore. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. But some voices won't stay silent. The breathing behind the iron door was too steady to be human. Too rhythmic to be natural. Daniel stood frozen beside me, his face pale. I stared at the word Evelyn scratched into the rusted metal, the name twisting like a wound. Ethan, we shouldn't be here. His voice barely broke the heavy silence, but I wasn't listening. I pressed my palm flat against the door, feeling its unnatural coldness seep into my skin. The breathing didn't stop. She's alive. Daniel shook his head slowly. Whoa. Not Evelyn. Not anymore. Soft whispers in the dark. You can't erase me, Maggie. A low, unsettling hum in response. Watch me. My fingers brushed over the thin gap between the door and its frame. No handle. No lock. Only symbols. Strange, spiraling marks carved deep into the iron. Symbols I didn't recognize. These weren't here by accident, I muttered. Daniel's eyes locked onto the symbols, his voice tightening. They're meant to keep something in. Not someone. Something. I pulled my hand back, heart pounding. Then why is it still breathing? The air thickened as the breathing grew louder. A whisper followed it, soft and broken. Ethan. I jerked back, my breath catching. Did you hear that? Daniel's eyes darkened. Whoa. And you didn't either. But I had. The voice was soft, strained. Familiar. Ethan, help me. The walls felt closer now, the stone pressing in. We can't leave her here, I said, voice cracking. Daniel grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back. You don't understand. Maggie didn't just lock her away. She changed her. I shook my head. She's my aunt. She was. His grip tightened. But Maggie doesn't leave loose ends. If Evelyn was still Evelyn, she'd be dead. The words hit me hard. What are you saying? Daniel's face was cold. I'm saying that whatever's behind that door is something else now. And Maggie wants it to stay there. I stared at the door. Evelyn's name burned into my mind. The voice echoed again. Help me, please. But the tone shifted, darker this time. You belong here too. Maggie standing over a crying woman. Evelyn curled on the floor. You could have been loved, Evelyn. Evelyn sobbing, shaking her head. I don't want your love. Maggie's voice soft and lethal. Then you'll have nothing. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This isn't right. Daniel moved toward the passage. We need to go. But the door groaned. On its own. No. Daniel whispered. The metal warped, twisting unnaturally, as though something inside was pushing outward. We need to leave. Daniel grabbed my arm. But I couldn't move. The voice from behind the door shifted again. No longer Evelyn's. Deeper. Hungrier. Ethan, let me out. A loud crack split the air. The door buckled. Then silence. We didn't wait. Daniel yanked me down the corridor, our footsteps pounding against the stone. But even as we ran, I could hear it. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Something dragging. Following. We burst back into the attic, slamming the trapdoor shut. Daniel leaned against it, chest heaving. We shouldn't have gone down there. I could barely breathe, the air in the attic suffocating. She's still down there, I gasped. Daniel's face twisted. That's exactly where she belongs. But I couldn't stop hearing the voice. Ethan. I staggered away from the trapdoor, the walls of the attic pressing in. There had to be more. Something Maggie missed. I turned toward the far corner, where old furniture was stacked like barricades. Something caught my eye. A small ornate mirror. Its glass cracked, its frame rusted. But in its reflection, something moved behind me. I spun around. Nothing. But in the mirror, the reflection flickered. Woman. Not Maggie. Not Evelyn. Someone else. Her mouth opened but no sound came. Then, slowly, she raised a hand and pointed. Not at me. At the mirror itself. At something inside it. I leaned in, breath fogging the glass. Something shimmered beneath the cracks. Letters. Scratched into the back of the mirror. Remember me. The glass cracked louder. Ethan. Daniel's shout tore through the room. I whipped around. But I was alone. Daniel was gone. The attic door was closed. And the whisper was behind me. You found me. Some reflections reveal more than faces. They reveal the rot beneath the skin. Daniel was gone. The attic door was sealed shut, though I hadn't heard it close. The silence gnawed at me, heavy and absolute. But it wasn't the silence that terrified me. It was the mirror. Its cracked surface shimmered faintly in the dim attic light. Behind the fractures, Evelyn's reflection stared back at me. Her eyes weren't pleading anymore. They were knowing. You found me. Her mouth didn't move, but the words slipped into my mind like smoke. I took a step back. This isn't real. But it was. And the mirror pulsed. An almost imperceptible ripple, like water disturbed by a breath. Evelyn, younger, standing before the same mirror. It sees what they hide, she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the frame. From the shadows, Maggie's voice, low and cold. Be careful where you look, Evelyn. Some things stare back. I should have smashed the mirror. But something in me knew it wouldn't matter. The cracks weren't on the glass. They were in the family. You remember now, don't you? Evelyn's reflection tilted its head. What Maggie did to me. To all of us. What are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. The reflection smiled. I'm what she couldn't erase. I couldn't look away. The mirror rippled again. And the attic blurred. I wasn't standing in the attic anymore. I was in the past. The same house, but not as I knew it. The walls were intact, the furniture polished, and laughter echoed faintly from distant rooms. But something was wrong. No shadows. No warmth. Only echoes of life, distorted and hollow. Welcome back. Turn. Evelyn stood at the top of the stairs. Live. Whole. But her eyes were wrong. Cold. Me. This is where it began. Maggie and Evelyn standing in the family parlor. You don't belong here, Maggie hissed. Neither do you, Evelyn shot back. Tense silence. Then Maggie smiled thinly. But I make the rules. The vision rippled again. The parlor faded. Now I stood in the greenhouse. Only it was alive, vibrant. Flowers bloomed in full color, vines curling upward. In the center, Maggie stood beside a young man. My father. But he looked different. His expression was soft, trusting. Maggie's hand lingered on his arm, too familiar. You're stronger than Evelyn, she purred. Thomas smiled faintly. She's not like us. My stomach turned. Do you see now? Evelyn's voice coiled around me. I staggered back. Oh. He wouldn't. But he did. The greenhouse darkened. The flowers withered in seconds. Maggie's smile remained sharp as ever. Blood binds us, Thomas. Don't forget that. He didn't pull away. The vision shattered. I was back in the attic, gasping. The mirror pulsed again. She made him believe it was love, Evelyn whispered. But it was control. I shook my head. Why show me this? Her reflection darkened. Because you're next. Maggie, older, sitting in the garden, whispering to herself. Some stems must be cut to let the others bloom. A glint of steel. Snipping roses at the root. And some must be grafted. The attic groaned. Footsteps above me. But the attic had no upstairs. Turned slowly. The trapdoor was opening. But it wasn't Daniel. It was Maggie. Or something wearing her face. You shouldn't have looked, Ethan. Her eyes glinted in the dark. Now you'll never unsee. I backed away, the mirror pressing coldly against my spine. Maggie stepped forward. But her reflection didn't follow. Evelyn's did. She was still smiling. But it wasn't kind. Let me in. The mirror pulsed once more. And crack. Not glass. Reality. Maggie lunged, her smile breaking into a snarl. I had no choice. Turned. And smashed my fist into the mirror. The glass shattered inward. And the attic collapsed around me. Darkness swallowed me whole. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with voices. Familiar. Not. He's ready now. No, he's not. But he will be. Soft laughter. Maggie's. And Evelyn's. Together. I woke up on cold stone. The hidden corridor. The iron door before me. But it was open now. And inside. Daniel. His back to me. Staring at something. Daniel. My voice cracked. He didn't move. I stepped closer. Daniel. Then I saw it. Not Evelyn. Not anymore. Something else. Turned slowly. And smiled. Welcome home, Ethan. I always thought the darkness in this family came from Maggie. I was wrong. It was always in our blood. Daniel stood motionless in the doorway. His back turned to me. Beyond him, in the cold stone chamber, the figure shifted. Not Evelyn. Not anymore. Welcome home, Ethan. The voice slithered around me, deceptively soft, but its edge carried something ancient, something wrong. Daniel didn't move. Daniel. My voice cracked. No answer. Then slowly he turned. His face was pale, expression distant, as though he wasn't fully there. It's in all of us, Ethan. His voice wasn't entirely his own. I took a step back. What are you talking about? Maggie stands in the greenhouse, pruning roses. A stem will grow wild if not guided, she murmurs, snipping a rose at its base. Soft chuckle. But blood. Blood always remembers its path. Daniel's eyes glistened unnaturally under the dim light. It was never about Evelyn. His tone was detached, as if reciting a memory not his own. It's always been about us. About keeping the family pure. I stared at him, dread pooling in my stomach. You sound like her. Daniel tilted his head. Maybe that's because she was right. The figure behind him moved closer. It wasn't Evelyn anymore, but a grotesque distortion of her. Her face was cracked like porcelain, her smile too wide. But it was her eyes that terrified me. Hollow. Yet somehow still watching. Maggie taught me how to remember. The thing rasped. Would you like to remember too? No. I lunged for Daniel, grabbing his arm, yanking him back. His skin was cold, unnaturally so. But he didn't resist. Not yet. The figure laughed softly. Running won't change what's in your veins. We stumbled out of the chamber, back into the narrow corridor. But the walls felt closer now, as though the house itself was shifting. Daniel, snap out of it. I shook him violently. His eyes flickered, momentarily clear. Ethan. But then his expression darkened again. She's waiting. No, she's manipulating you. his face twisted in pain. You think you're not already part of this, he hissed. You think you're different. Family dinner years ago. Maggie watching Ethan as he eats, a quiet smile on her lips. You're special, Ethan. Her hand gently touches his shoulder. You always have been. A fleeting glance between Maggie and Daniel. Unspoken. Heavy. She chose you. Daniel snapped, his voice breaking. Just like she chose him. Just like she chose me. I stumbled back, the pieces starting to fall into place. It wasn't random. Maggie's manipulations weren't chaotic. They were deliberate. Calculated. Why me? My voice was barely a whisper. Daniel's expression softened for a moment. Because you're strong. Then it hardened again. And because you won't run. The walls groaned. The figure was getting closer. But it wasn't Evelyn anymore. It was all of them. Faces I recognized. Family. Twisted. Melded together. Is empty. We are family, Ethan. And family stays together. I turned and ran, pulling Daniel with me. The corridor stretched endlessly. Walls pulsing like veins. We have to get out. There is no out. Daniel screamed. This house is Maggie. His words hit like ice. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was alive. It was her. We burst into the main hall, the air suffocating. Portraits lined the walls. Family members, faces familiar but wrong. Their eyes followed us. But one portrait stopped me cold. It was me. Older. Smiling. And beside me Maggie. Her hand on my shoulder. Daniel collapsed to his knees, gasping. It's in our blood. He whispered. You can't fight it. I turned to him, shaking my head. Oh, I'm not like her. But you could be. The voice wasn't Daniel's. I spun around. Maggie stood at the top of the grand staircase. Composed. Smiling. It was always going to be you, Ethan. Her eyes glimmered. Why fight what you were born to be? Maggie holding a baby, whispering softly. You'll do what they couldn't. She kisses the child's forehead. You'll finish what I started. I clenched my fists. You manipulated them all. You broke them. Her smile never faltered. I prepared them. For what? Snap. Maggie descended slowly. For you. The house trembled. Walls cracked, revealing black veins pulsing beneath. Daniel screamed. But Maggie raised a hand. Silence. You have a choice, Ethan. Her voice was calm. Join me. Or be forgotten. I glanced at Daniel, broken and shaking. I looked at the portraits. Myself. Then back to Maggie. You think this family is worth saving? Her smile widened. No, dear. I think it's worth continuing. The walls began to bleed. Darkness creeping in. I took a step forward. Closer to her. Closer to the truth. Then let's finish this. Blood can bind, but it can also choke. I never thought I'd have to choose between saving my family and destroying it. But Maggie always knew I would. Welcome home, Ethan. Her words echoed in my mind, weaving through the suffocating silence. Daniel stood beside me, his breathing ragged, his eyes hollow. Ahead of us, Maggie descended the grand staircase, each step deliberate and slow, her elegant figure cloaked in shadows. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with her presence, its walls groaning under the weight of secrets too old to remember. But now I remembered everything. Young Ethan, maybe 6, sits quietly on Maggie's lap in the grand parlor. She strokes his hair lovingly, a soft smile on her face. Do you know what makes a family strong, Ethan? She whispers. He shakes his head. Sacrifice. Her eyes darken. But not everyone is willing to make it. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something sour. Okay. Daniel finally spoke. His voice cracked and thin. She'll never let us leave. Maggie chuckled softly, her voice as smooth as velvet. Leave, she echoed. Oh, Daniel. You were never meant to leave. Her eyes flicked to me. Neither was Ethan. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. This ends tonight. Maggie's smile didn't falter. Oh, it does. But the ending is yours to choose. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something. A small object glinting under a nearby table. Silver key. But not just any key. It had the same symbols carved into it as the iron door we found in the basement. Daniel didn't notice it. But Maggie did. Her eyes sharpened. Ah, you found it. I didn't move. What does it unlock? Her smile deepened. Not what, Ethan? Who? Daniel's breath hitched. Whoa. Ethan, don't. Maggie tilted her head. Wouldn't you like to know what I was protecting you from? The air grew colder, pressing against my skin like ice. The walls creaked as if the house itself listened. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch, their painted eyes following me. Especially the one of my father, Amos. His painted hand rested on a younger Maggie's shoulder. But something was off. His smile. It was too wide. You want answers. Maggie's voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. Use the key. Open the door. See what I've kept hidden. Daniel grabbed my arm. Oh, that's what she wants. But my eyes were locked on the key. The cold metal glinted, almost pulsing in my hand. Maggie and Thomas stand in the greenhouse. He can't know, Thomas muttered. Maggie's hand tightened on his arm. He'll know when he's ready. Thomas looked away. And if he's not? Maggie smiled softly. Then he'll die. Daniel's grip tightened. She's playing you. Then why is she afraid of what's behind that door? Shut back. Maggie's smile didn't crack. But her eyes did. Just for a moment. Fear. The key wasn't just a key. It was a choice. To open that door meant embracing the family's curse, or breaking it. You can't change what's been done, Maggie said softly. But you can decide what comes next. Daniel shook his head. Or you can walk away, Ethan. Before it's too late. But deep down I knew. There was no walking away. Not anymore. The iron door, shut tight, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Maggie's voice distant. Some things are better left forgotten. But another voice, Evelyn's, whispering. And some things will never stay buried. I took a step forward. Maggie didn't move. Daniel's voice broke. Don't do this. But my hand closed around the key. The weight of it felt heavier than metal. It felt inevitable. I turned the key in my hand. I need to know. Daniel's face collapsed in despair. Maggie's smile returned. And the house held its breath. Some doors should never be opened. I opened one anyway. The cold metal of the key bit into my palm as I stood frozen before the door. I had already made my choice. But now, standing here, doubt clawed at me. What if this was exactly what Maggie wanted? Behind me, Daniel's ragged breathing filled the silence. Don't do this, Ethan. But I couldn't stop. Not now. My fingers moved on their own, guiding the key into the lock. Click. The sound echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. A thick, damp air crept from the cracks of the door, heavy with a scent of mold and something far fouler. The wood beneath my feet groaned, as if warning me to turn back. The hallway seemed darker now, the flickering light behind us barely cutting through the suffocating black. I pushed the door open. Didn't creak. Sighed. The room beyond wasn't what I expected. No bones. No blood. Just silence. A vast circular chamber stretched out before me. At the center, a large wooden table stood beneath a shattered chandelier, its broken crystals scattered like jagged ice across the floor. Papers and photographs littered the table, untouched by dust. Daniel stepped beside me, his voice a whisper. What is this place? I approached the table. Dozens of photographs, some black and white, some recent, all of family members. But each photo had something strange. Faces scratched out, some marked with an X, others with dates. One photo caught my eye. 'Twas of me. Not as I was now, but older. My face was circled in red ink. The last one. Daniel leaned closer, scanning the photos. Why are these here? He muttered. Among the photos were letters. Old yellowed paper. One letter was addressed to Maggie, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. To Margaret, you must understand. The bloodline must remain pure. He is the final piece. Do not fail us again. No signature. Just a symbol. A serpent devouring its own tail. The serpent. It wasn't the first time I'd seen it. It was carved into the iron door, etched into the key. And now, in this letter. What did it mean? Daniel picked up another photo. Look. It was Evelyn, but younger, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. But Maggie was there too. Between them, smiling. Some families are bound by love. Ours is bound by blood. Ethan, we need to go. Daniel's voice snapped me back. But before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. The lights flickered, then went out. Darkness swallowed us whole. The only sound was Daniel's quickened breath. And something else. Faint scraping. From the shadows. Daniel spun, voice shaking. Who's there? No answer. But the scraping grew louder. Closer. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam of light cut through the dark, landing on the far wall. And I froze. The walls weren't stone. They were covered in carvings. Thousands of names. Scratch deep. Some names I recognized. Family names. Others were crossed out. But near the bottom one name stood out. Freshly carved. Ethan. This is a tomb. Daniel whispered. Well, it was worse. It was a ledger. A record. Of every person Maggie had marked. And now my name was next. But why? Was this room built by Maggie? Or had she been following orders? That letter. Do not fail us again. Who was pulling the strings? Daniel grabbed my shoulder. We're not alone. The scraping sound turned into a dragging. Closer. Heavier. The beam of light shook in my hands, scanning the room. It landed on a figure. Slumped in the corner. Barely moving. Daniel stepped forward. Wait, I hissed. But it was too late. The figure shifted. A low, gurgling sound filled the room. It wasn't Evelyn. It wasn't even human. Crawled forward. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its face was a patchwork of different features. Eyes that didn't match, lips stitched into a permanent grin. A mockery of human form. Daniel stumbled back. What is that? I couldn't answer. But deep down I knew. This wasn't born. It was made. Maggie's soft whisper. Perfection takes time, Ethan. Mistakes must be corrected. The creature's head tilted. It began to crawl faster. Straight for us. Run! He yelled. We bolted for the door, yanking at the handle. Daniel slammed his shoulder into it. No use. The creature shrieked. In desperation, my eyes darted to the key still in the lock. Turned on its own. The door creaked open. But beyond it wasn't the hallway. It was a staircase. Leading down. Further. Daniel hesitated. I didn't. Every family has skeletons in the closet. Ours are still alive. The air grew colder with every step we took down the spiraling stone staircase. The narrow walls pressed in, carved with symbols I couldn't decipher. Serpents swallowing their own tails, eyes carved in jagged strokes, and something worse, faces. Distorted faces. Daniel's shaky voice broke the silence. How far does this go? I didn't answer. Because deep down I feared it never ended. The dampness seeped into my skin, and the faint dripping of water echoed, masking other sounds, subtle scraping, distant whispers. Or maybe they weren't distant. Maybe they were closer than I realized. The flickering beam from my flashlight trembled, casting long, twisted shadows along the uneven walls. Daniel's breath fogged in the cold. His steps hesitant. But we couldn't stop. At the bottom of the stairs, the path split. 2 tunnels. One veered left, swallowing itself in complete blackness. The other faintly glowed, a soft, pulsing red. Daniel swallowed hard. We can't split up. But Maggie's voice echoed in my mind. Some doors are meant to be opened, Ethan. But not all at once. Which path was the right one? Or worse, which was the trap? The faint red glow caught my eye. Etched into the stone beside the glowing tunnel was a symbol, the serpent. And beneath it, a single word scratched in a familiar shaky hand. Return. Daniel tugged at my sleeve. Ethan, let's go the other way. Please. But something pulled me toward the red glow. I moved before I could think. Daniel cursed under his breath but followed. The tunnel narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The glow grew stronger, revealing the source. Torches, freshly lit. But no heat radiated from them. Their flames swayed in an invisible wind. And then I heard it. Faint hum. Not mechanical. Not human. It was alive. The walls vibrated softly with it, as if the stone itself was breathing. Daniel spoke in a whisper. We shouldn't be here. But we already were. The tunnel ended in a massive iron door, identical to the first. But this one had no lock. Only a handprint, freshly smeared in blood. My blood. Maggie's soft whisper, distant but clear. Blood opens more than just wounds. Without thinking, I placed my palm against the cold metal. It was warm. Too warm. The door shuddered and creaked open. Daniel stumbled back. Jesus, Ethan, don't. But it was too late. The door groaned open, revealing a massive underground hall. Pillars lined the room, carved into distorted human forms, their faces frozen in agony. Chains dangled from the ceiling, some still swaying. But what stopped me was the centerpiece. A stone altar. Cracked. Stained. And on it, body. Daniel gasped. Is that? Well, it wasn't Evelyn. It was someone else. Thomas Whitmore. My father. But he was supposed to be dead. His body was twisted unnaturally. His face contorted in a silent scream. And carved into his chest was the serpent symbol. Fresh. Daniel backed away. Whoa. This can't be real. But it was. And it wasn't over. But something didn't add up. Maggie had never spoken of my father's death. No funeral. No closure. Now I knew why. He had never left. He had been here. All along. Footsteps echoed behind us. Low. Deliberate. Daniel spun, fists raised. Who's there? The figure stepped forward, half shrouded in darkness. It wasn't Maggie. It was Evelyn. But not as I remembered. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale. And she was smiling. You finally made it, Ethan. Her voice was wrong. To come. To knowing. Daniel staggered. Evelyn. You're alive. She tilted her head. Alive. No, Daniel. I'm awake. Her smile widened. And soon you will be too. She stepped aside, revealing what lay behind her. More bodies. Bound. Still breathing. Faces I recognized. Family. Friends. Neighbors. All of them marked with the serpent. Waiting. For what? What is this? I whispered. Evelyn's voice was a whisper of silk. The beginning. She extended her hand. Come, Ethan. See what Maggie feared. Daniel pulled at me. Oh. Don't listen to her. But Evelyn's words curled around me like smoke. Your blood brought you here. It will set them free. Maggie's voice trembling. They weren't meant to wake up, Ethan. I took a step forward. Daniel's grip tightened. Ethan, please. But Evelyn's eyes gleamed. You've already chosen. The torches flared violently. And behind Evelyn, the bodies began to move. One by one. Eyes snapping open. Staring at me. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The silence was suffocating. No footsteps. No breath. Just the creaking of the iron door behind us slowly swinging shut. Daniel's hand gripped my shoulder. His nails digging in. Ethan, we need to leave. But I couldn't move. Because Evelyn was smiling. And the bodies were moving. The soft shuffle of feet scraped against stone, slow and deliberate. Eyes snapped open, reflecting the flickering red torchlight. But their eyes weren't human. Milky. Vacant. Like something ancient was staring back through them. Daniel's voice trembled. What did she do to them? Evelyn tilted her head, her voice like silk against steel. They've always been like this. You just never noticed. One figure stepped forward. A man, gaunt and gray. His face vaguely familiar. Uncle Greg. But not as I remembered him. His mouth moved but no sound came. In his hand he clutched something. Locket. Not Evelyn's. Maggie's. The same serpent symbol glimmered on its surface. Daniel leaned in. Is that? I reached out instinctively. But the locket burned to the touch. Searing pain shot up my arm but I couldn't let go. Images flooded my mind. Maggie standing in the same underground hall. But it wasn't ruined. It was alive. Torches burned brightly, and the stone altar gleamed. Around her stood the family. Alive. Whole. And smiling. But their eyes were wrong. Voice echoed. Not Maggie's. Deeper. Older. Blood remembers. Blood returns. The vision shattered. I stumbled back gasping. Daniel caught me. Ethan. What the hell was that? But I couldn't speak. Because Evelyn was still smiling. Now you understand. The figures closed in, slow and methodical. Daniel yanked me back. We're leaving. But Evelyn stepped forward. Leave. Then you are here. This is your place. You opened the door. Her eyes darkened. And they are awake because of you. The torchlight flickered violently. The walls seemed to breathe. And from the shadows, another figure emerged. Maggie. But she wasn't alone. Behind her more of them. Not family. Strangers. Each bearing the serpent mark. Daniel's voice cracked. Who are they? Maggie's face was ashen. Mistakes. Her eyes locked on Evelyn. I told you never to come here. Evelyn laughed. You told me many things, Mother. And I listened to none of them. Maggie's hands clutched a rusted key. The same serpent etched into it. But this one was split in half. Broken. Daniel pointed. What does that open? Maggie's grip tightened. Not what. Who? Evelyn's grin widened. It doesn't matter. You've lost, Mother. She raised her hand. The walls trembled. Chains rattled. And behind the altar, something massive began to move. For a moment the ground seemed to tilt. I wasn't in the hall anymore. I was back in the house. In Maggie's room. The locked drawer. I was opening it. Inside the serpent locket. Photograph. Of Maggie. And Evelyn. Smiling. But the date was wrong. 1956. Gasp snapping back. Daniel shook me. Ethan. Stay with me. But Maggie was already moving. We have to seal it. She shoved the broken key into the altar. The stone screamed. Cracks split across its surface. Evelyn lunged. No. Evelyn's voice wasn't human anymore. Maggie twisted the key. The ground buckled. Daniel fell. The altar split apart, revealing a void. Dark. Endless. And something inside was waking up. Maggie screamed. Ethan, run. But it was too late. From the darkness something reached out. And it touched me. Not all curses are whispered in the dark. Some are spoken at the dinner table. The room trembled beneath our feet. Stone cracked. The cold air thickened, tasting of iron and dust. Daniel grabbed my arm. His voice barely a whisper. Ethan, what did she do? But the answer was already unfolding before us. Maggie stood by the shattered altar, clutching the broken key to her chest. Blood trickled down her palm, dripping onto the stone. Evelyn's laughter echoed through the dark. You think sealing the door will save you? Her voice fractured, laced with something inhuman. You broke this family long before I did. The walls groaned. A figure stirred behind the altar. Not human. Not anymore. A grotesque fusion of faces. Blending, shifting. Uncle Greg. Cousin Marcus. Even my father. Twisting together, stitched by something far older than blood. The serpent sigil on the floor glowed faintly, cracks splintering outward. But something was wrong. At the edges of the symbol, letters were missing. Burned away. Incomplete. Daniel squinted. This isn't finished. Maggie's eyes widened. No. The ritual was never completed. Evelyn's smile darkened. But it will be. A memory surfaced. One I didn't know I had. Maggie younger, standing in the same hall. Evelyn beside her. Barely a teenager. Maggie was whispering to someone in the shadows. They can't know. Not yet. A man's hand reached out, gripping Maggie's shoulder. You started this, Margaret. Now you must finish it. But I couldn't see his face. The walls bled. Dark liquid seeped from cracks, carrying whispers with it. The serpent's sigil pulsed like a heartbeat. The air grew thick, pressing against my skin. Daniel gagged. What is that smell? Rotting flowers. And burnt flesh. And blinked. And suddenly we were back at the dinner table. The family laughing. Clinking glasses. Maggie smiling at me. But Evelyn was gone. So was Daniel. I turned to Maggie. Where's Daniel? She tilted her head. Who? The ground cracked. And I was back in the hall. Maggie lunged at Evelyn, the broken key raised like a dagger. But Evelyn didn't flinch. With a flick of her wrist, Maggie was thrown backward, slamming into the stone wall. Blood spattered. Daniel cursed. We have to stop this. Evelyn raised both hands. The serpent symbol ignited in flames. And the fused creature behind the altar groaned, stretching toward us. I noticed it then. The serpent wasn't biting its tail. It was eating something smaller. A smaller serpent. Consuming itself. Evelyn spoke softly. The old must devour the young, to live forever. Daniel's breath caught. It's not a curse. It's a cycle. Evelyn stepped forward. You think I'm the villain, Ethan? I'm not the one who made this family bleed. Her eyes burned. Grandma did. She pointed to Maggie, crumpled on the ground. He started this. I'm just finishing it. Maggie coughed, blood on her lips. I did it to protect us. Evelyn sneered. Oh. You did it to control us. Daniel lunged at Evelyn, but she vanished in a flicker of smoke. A scream echoed. But it wasn't Evelyn. It was Maggie. Something was pulling her into the ground. And dozens of hands. Clawing. Bragging. Help me. But Evelyn only laughed. Let the past bury itself. The ground split beneath Daniel's feet. I reached for him. But something else did too. Hand. Familiar. My mother's. But she was dead. Long dead. Her grip tightened. And whispered in my ear. Finish what she started. Sometimes the truth is not hidden in shadows but whispered in plain sight. The walls seemed to breathe. I wasn't sure if it was the house or if it was me. Daniel's voice broke through the suffocating silence. Ethan, the symbol. Turned slowly. The serpent sigil on the stone floor was no longer glowing. It was bleeding. The thick, dark liquid oozed from the cracks in the sigil, winding its way toward us. It smelled of copper and decay. Daniel took a step back, his face pale. It's alive. But it wasn't the sigil we needed to fear. It was what it was awakening. A glimmer caught my eye. Half buried in the oozing blood was a fragment of an old photograph. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was torn, only showing half a face. My grandmother. And a man with piercing eyes. Not my grandfather. Daniel peered over my shoulder. Who is that? I didn't answer because I didn't know. But deep down I feared I did. Suddenly a memory struck like lightning. Maggie's hushed voice. Some things are better left forgotten. A child's cry in the distance. A door slamming. And that man's voice, low and menacing. Finish what you started, Margaret. I staggered back to the present. Was this the man in the photo? The one who started it all? Daniel's voice was distant now, echoing as if underwater. The hall stretched endlessly. No walls, no ceiling, only whispers. Finish it. End the cycle. I wasn't sure if the voices were real, or if they were mine. Evelyn stepped forward from the shadows, her eyes dark and hollow. You found it, didn't you? I tightened my grip on the photo. What is this? She tilted her head. Proof. Daniel growled. Proof of what? Evelyn smiled, slow and cruel. That Maggie was never the mastermind. She was only a pawn. Evelyn pointed to the serpent sigil. Look closer. The blood traced a new pattern. The serpent wasn't devouring itself. It was circling something smaller. Child. Daniel's breath caught. It's not about Maggie. Evelyn nodded. It's about him. Her finger pointed at me. You were born into this, Ethan. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. Maggie only did what she thought was necessary. To protect you. To protect the bloodline. I shook my head. Oh. She manipulated us. Evelyn's laughter echoed. And yet here you are, holding the key to finishing what she began. I looked at the photo again. The man's eyes seemed to follow me. Who is he? Evelyn's smile faded. Our real grandfather. Daniel lunged forward. She's lying. But Evelyn didn't move. Instead, the walls around us shifted. Portraits of our family. But altered. Faces scratched out. Eyes burned away. And in every one, that man stood beside Maggie. Smiling. The ground trembled beneath us. The serpent's sigil split apart, revealing a dark staircase spiraling downward. Evelyn stepped back, gesturing toward it. He's waiting, Ethan. Daniel grabbed my arm. Don't listen to her. But I couldn't look away. Because from the depths of the staircase, a voice rose. Familiar. Come home, my son. And it wasn't Maggie's voice. It was his. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But what if they were never locked? How far would you go to uncover the truth if it meant destroying everything you love? The narrow stone staircase spiraled endlessly downward, each step groaning under our weight. The air grew colder, denser, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. The scent of damp earth mingled with something acrid, something metallic. Daniel's flashlight flickered against the damp walls, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. It feels like the walls are breathing, I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't respond. Evelyn's footsteps were the only steady sound. We were descending into the heart of something ancient, something alive. Midway down the staircase, we passed carvings etched into the stone. Symbols, twisted serpents, interlocked rings, and the familiar serpent sigil now split in two. Evelyn paused, tracing the carvings with a trembling finger. They marked this path for themselves, she murmured. Daniel leaned in. Who did? Evelyn didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a phrase beneath the sigils. Latin. Sanguinem vincit omnia. Blood conquers all. The same phrase Maggie had whispered in her sleep. The words unlocked something in me. A flash of Maggie, standing in the garden, clipping roses at their stems. They can't bloom if they grow wild. Child's cry. A man's voice. Finish what you started, Margaret. The echo of a door slamming. I stumbled, gripping the wall to steady myself. Daniel's hand tightened on my shoulder. What did you see? But how could I explain something I didn't understand? The staircase finally ended in a massive wooden door. Ancient. Rotting, yet impossibly solid. A rusted serpent-shaped handle coiled around a keyhole. Daniel reached for it, but Evelyn stopped him. Wait. She pointed to the handle. Embedded in the serpent's eye was a bloodstone, deep red, pulsing faintly. Evelyn pulled a small dagger from her coat, its blade blackened with age. Without hesitation, she sliced her palm and pressed it to the stone. The door groaned and slowly creaked open. Only blood opens the way. The door swung open to reveal a cavernous room lit by flickering candles. On the walls hung portraits, every ancestor, every family member. But their eyes had been gouged out. At the center stood a massive stone altar. And on it a figure sat waiting. Not Maggie. Not the man from the photograph. It was me. Or rather, a version of me. Pale, lifeless, with hollow eyes staring back. Welcome home, the figure rasped. Daniel gasped, stepping back. What the hell is this? Evelyn's expression darkened. This is the truth. The bloodline isn't cursed. It's preserved. The figure, my reflection, smiled. Maggie didn't betray you, Ethan. She saved you. From what? I demanded, my voice cracking. From yourself. The room seemed to pulse with those words. Daniel stepped forward. This is another trick. Evelyn's lying. But Evelyn laughed, cold and sharp. Oh, Daniel. You've been the pawn all along. She turned to me. Maggie wasn't controlling the family. She was obeying him. She gestured to the altar. And now it's your turn. Daniel lunged, but the ground split between us. A chasm yawned open, separating me from him. And from Evelyn. The altar began to sink, dragging my reflection with it. Choose, Ethan. Evelyn screamed. Save your family or save yourself. The walls blurred. Daniel's shouts faded. The cavern distorted, spinning. Was this real? Was any of it? The reflection on the altar grinned. You always had a choice. You just didn't want to make it. The ground beneath me cracked. Evelyn reached out. Take my hand. Daniel's voice echoed. Don't trust her. And then, from the depths of the abyss, another voice. Familiar. Ethan, come home. It wasn't Maggie. It wasn't the figure on the altar. It was my mother. But she had been dead for years. Hadn't she? I always believed the dead rest in peace, but tonight, it feels like they've all woken up, and they're watching me. The Whitmore estate loomed before Ethan like a monstrous silhouette etched against the stormy sky. The windows, dark and hollow, seemed to watch him with silent judgment. Every step he took toward the front door felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground resisted him. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the gnarled oak trees that lined the cobblestone path, their limbs clawing at the air. The mansion seemed larger than he remembered, swallowing the moonlight into its darkened walls. He paused, shivering, though not from the cold. He hadn't been back here in years, not since Maggie's death. But something had called him back, something unfinished. A faint glimmer caught his eye. Half buried beneath the withered leaves was a silver locket. His breath caught in his throat. It was identical to the one he had found in Maggie's drawer, but this one was different. He crouched to pick it up, fingers brushing against the cold metal. The locket was open. Inside, instead of a photo, a single word was etched. Remember. He swallowed hard and pocketed it. The massive oak door groaned as it slowly creaked open on its own. Ethan hadn't touched it. The scent hit him immediately. Stale air laced with decayed roses and Maggie's perfume, sickly sweet and suffocating. The grand foyer stretched out before him, cloaked in thick shadows. The family portraits lined the walls, but something was wrong. He moved closer to one of the portraits. His stomach twisted. The faces were blurred, as if someone had smeared them with ash. Only Maggie's portrait remained untouched, her painted eyes unervingly lifelike, following him. Her hand rested on Daniel's shoulder in a possessive grip. The sound startled him. The old grandfather clock at the end of the hall had been broken for decades, but now it ticked steadily. Each tick grew louder, drilling into his mind. A younger Ethan creeping down the hall, his small hand reaching for the locked study door. A sharp voice, Evelyn's, cut through the air. Not for you. Daniel's voice, angry and shaking. This family is cursed because of you. Maggie's whisper against his ear. Some doors should never open. Ethan blinked, the present snapping back into focus. He approached Maggie's old study. The door, once bolted shut, now hung slightly ajar. The study was a frozen moment in time. Dust settled in the air like snow, and the curtains sagged, heavy with grime. Maggie's massive mahogany desk sat in the corner, dominating the room. One drawer was slightly open. Ethan's breath quickened. Inside, he found a stack of letters bound with a red ribbon. The top envelope was addressed to Daniel, But the handwriting wasn't Maggie's. It was Evelyn's. He pulled the ribbon loose, hands trembling. The letters spoke of betrayal, of promises broken, of secrets too dark to confess. And beneath the letters was another locket, heavier than the first. This one bore a serpent eating its own tail, the Ouroboros, the symbol of endless cycles. He snapped it open. No photo. Only a lock of hair. Dark. Not Maggie's. Ethan's head swam. Had Evelyn been protecting him, or had she been hiding something all along? His memories felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. A sudden creak behind him made him whirl around. Ethan. His mother's voice, trembling. Evelyn stood in the doorway, pale and breathless. In her hand she gripped a knife. But it wasn't aimed at him. It was pointed past him. Into the shadows of the room. Escalation of tension continues. Slowly Ethan turned. From the darkness a figure emerged. Daniel. But it wasn't the Daniel he remembered. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken and hollow. His lips curled in a grimace that was almost a smile. His skin was pale, stretched thin over protruding bones. Daniel raised a trembling hand. Ethan. You shouldn't have come back. Ethan's throat dried. Before he could respond, Evelyn's voice cracked. He's not Daniel. Daniel, or the thing wearing his face, tilted its head in a slow, unnatural motion. No, it rasped, lips splitting into a grin. But she is. The air grew colder. A figure moved in the shadows behind Ethan. Maggie. Her silhouette materialized, thin and towering, her white hair spilling over her shoulders. Her eyes glimmered in the dark, cold and empty. Symbolism and foreshadowing. In her hand she cradled a rose. Its stem snapped, its petals withered and black. Ethan's breath caught. Maggie's lips moved, barely audible. It never ends. The floorboards groaned beneath Ethan's feet. The house seemed to close in around him. Daniel, or whatever he was, took a step forward. Maggie raised the dead rose to her lips, whispering words Ethan couldn't understand. And somewhere deep within the mansion, the grandfather clock began to chime. Once. The walls trembled. And something else, something much older than Maggie, began to wake. Some houses keep secrets in their walls. Ours. It whispers them back. Ethan couldn't move. The air around him had thickened, pressing against his skin like a second, suffocating layer. Evelyn's trembling form stood behind him, her knife glinting in the faint light, still raised but shaking. Daniel, or the creature pretending to be him, watched them both with eyes that seemed to sink deeper into his skull. And Maggie. Maggie was watching too. Her figure was still, unnervingly still, yet the way her head tilted ever so slightly made Ethan feel like prey cornered by a predator. The clock struck again. Each chime reverberated through the house, shaking dust from the walls, making the floor beneath Ethan's feet tremble. The sound wasn't just from the clock. It was deeper, lower, like something groaning from the foundation of the house. Ethan's eyes darted to the walls. A hairline crack spidered out from the corner, weaving through the faded wallpaper like veins. He could have sworn it wasn't there before. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. No louder than a breath. Help me. His head snapped to Evelyn. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Evelyn's wide eyes locked on Daniel. He's in the walls, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Build a sense of unease through sensory details. Atmosphere of dread. The walls seemed to shudder in response, the old wooden beams groaning under an invisible weight. The very air tasted stale, tinged with something metallic. Blood. No older than that. Maggie's brittle whisper cut through the suffocating silence. He wants out. Ethan staggered back. Who? But Maggie just smiled, a slow, cracking grin that didn't reach her empty eyes. Suddenly Ethan was 6 again. In the dead of night, creeping down the hall in his pajamas. His small hand reached for the cold brass doorknob of Maggie's study. Voice behind him. Don't open that door. He turned to see Evelyn standing in the dark, her face pale and unreadable. Why not, he had asked. Her answer came back to him now, chilling him to the core. Because you won't like what's on the other side. Ethan's breathing quickened. This wasn't just about Maggie or Daniel. The house itself was alive. No, not alive. Infested. Something was inside it, inside the walls. Watching. Waiting. His gaze darted to the staircase. We need to leave, he hissed to Evelyn. But Evelyn shook her head slowly. Oh, not yet. You need to see it. She turned and started toward the basement door. Ethan hesitated. The basement had always been off-limits. Maggie's strictest rule. The family had spoken about it in hushed tones, calling it the cold room. It was where Maggie kept things that didn't belong in the house. But it was part of the house, wasn't it? Like a lung that refused to breathe. Ethan's chest tightened. He followed Evelyn. The basement door groaned open, revealing a staircase descending into a suffocating blackness. Evelyn lit a candle from a nearby holder, the flame flickering violently as if struggling to stay alive. The walls here were different. Not covered in wallpaper or paint, but bare stone, sweating moisture. And then he noticed the carvings. Symbols. Hundreds of them. Circles within circles. Lines intersecting in impossible ways. And all of them burned into the stone as if seared by fire. Ethan reached out, running his fingers over one. Felt warm. Alive. Do you know what these mean? He whispered. Evelyn's lips trembled. No one does. Not even Maggie. Lie. Ethan could tell. But he said nothing. Because beneath his fingers the stone pulsed. Once. Like a heartbeat. His mind swirled. Had these symbols always been here? Or was the house changing? Or was he changing? Was Evelyn leading him to safety or deeper into Maggie's trap? The candle flickered, casting monstrous shadows along the walls. And then Ethan heard it again. The whisper. Clearer now. Ethan, help me. It wasn't Maggie's voice. It wasn't Daniel's. It was his father's. Escalation of tension continues. Ethan froze. His father had been dead for 15 years. The weight of the basement pressed in. He turned to Evelyn, throat dry. That's Dad. Evelyn didn't answer. Because she was staring ahead at the far wall. Door. One that shouldn't be there. It was carved into the stone, seamless except for a small iron handle. It pulsed faintly with that same heartbeat rhythm. Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. Do you want to know what Maggie was hiding? Ethan didn't answer. Because the door slowly creaked open on its own. And from the darkness beyond something moved. Not crawling. Not walking. Flowing. Like smoke. Like shadows given form. And in the black, 2 pinpricks of red light blinked open. Watching. Waiting. And then it spoke. Ethan, come home. Some doors are locked for a reason. But what if the key was never meant to be found? Ethan's breath hitched as the darkness beyond the stone door thickened. The 2 red pinpricks of light didn't move, yet they seemed closer now, bleeding into the shadows like slow dripping ink. Evelyn stood still, the candle in her trembling hand barely casting light against the suffocating dark. The whisper returned, softer this time. Come home, Ethan. His father's voice. But how could that be? Ethan's eyes darted to the symbols carved into the walls. The once cold stone now radiated warmth, each symbol pulsing faintly as though syncing with the slow, steady beat of a hidden heart. There, tucked in the corner, was a new symbol. One he hadn't noticed before. A circle broken by a jagged line. It wasn't ancient like the others. It was fresh. Scratched into the stone by trembling hands. Below it, in smeared letters, a single word. Daniel. His stomach dropped. Daniel had been here. Build a sense of unease through sensory details. Atmosphere of dread. A drop of moisture fell from the ceiling, landing on Ethan's shoulder. It was ice cold. But when he looked up, he saw no water. Only cracks. Thin, jagged cracks running along the stone ceiling, forming patterns too deliberate to be natural. They almost looked like veins, carrying something beneath the surface, something moving. The walls exhaled. Or maybe it was the wind. But the house had no wind. Ethan stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the stone doorway. Another memory. He was 12, sneaking into Maggie's parlor, drawn by the sound of muffled sobs. He had peeked around the corner and seen Maggie, no Margaret, kneeling on the floor, clutching a faded photograph to her chest. She was speaking to it. No one else can know. Not even Daniel. Not yet. And then she had begun to hum. A lullaby Ethan hadn't heard since he was a baby. But the photo wasn't of Daniel. It was of a man Ethan didn't recognize. Till now. The man had Ethan's eyes. His mouth. "Evelyn," Ethan whispered, his voice thin. "What is this place?" But Evelyn didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the dark figure beyond the door. "It's not Daniel," she finally said, her voice barely audible. It never was. The shadow shifted, but it did not step forward. Instead, the stone walls around them began to breathe, in slow, deliberate movements. The symbols glowed faintly, illuminating the corridor. And then Ethan noticed something new. Footprints, burnt into the stone, leading further into the black, leading to him. The broken circle etched beside Daniel's name wasn't random. It was identical to the emblem stitched into the corner of the old family portrait in the main hall, barely visible, hidden behind Maggie's shoulder. But now Ethan recognized it for what it was. Family crest, broken, like their bloodline, like him. Ethan's mind twisted, unraveling memories that no longer seemed true. Had Daniel ever truly been his brother? Or was he something Maggie had created? Or unleashed? Ethan tried to remember Daniel's laugh, his voice, his warmth. But it felt distant, artificial. As if remembering a character from a story, not a real person. Was Evelyn even Evelyn? She seemed too calm, too composed amidst the chaos. Her hand gripped the candle like it was a dagger. Her posture no longer that of a frightened sister, but of a watchful guardian. "You knew about this," Ethan accused, his voice trembling. Evelyn's head snapped toward him. "I didn't," she started but faltered. And that was enough. She did know. Maybe not everything, but enough to lead him here. To the door. To whatever was behind it. "Who are you really, Evelyn?" Ethan demanded. Her silence was more damning than any answer. Cliffhanger or shocking revelation. A soft click echoed in the air. The stone door creaked wider on its own, the shadows peeling back like curtains. Ethan stepped closer, compelled by a force he didn't understand. Inside, the walls of the room pulsed with that same organic rhythm. At the center stood a cradle. An old wooden cradle, rocking slowly. Or so it seemed. But as Ethan approached, he saw it. Locket. Identical to the one Maggie always wore. But this one was cracked. Inside was a photo. Of a baby. Not Daniel. Not Ethan. Third child. The inscription beneath the image sent a bolt of ice down Ethan's spine. "To my firstborn. May you forgive me." His name was Isaac. Ethan's hand trembled as he touched the locket. Behind him, the whisper returned. No longer soft. No longer distant. It was in his ear. "You are not the first, Ethan. Every family has its secrets. Ours were buried so deep, I didn't realize I was standing on top of them." The air in the forgotten chamber was thick, almost suffocating. Ethan's grip on the cracked locket tightened. The inscription inside seared into his mind. "To my firstborn. May you forgive me." Isaac. A name he had never heard, yet it felt heavier than his own. "Ethan," Evelyn's voice wavered behind him. But there was something different in her tone. Hesitation. Or was it guilt? Ethan slowly turned to face her, holding the locket up. "Explain this." Evelyn's eyes didn't meet his. Instead, they lingered on the cradle, then the dark corners of the room. I didn't know about this," she whispered, but her voice cracked at the edges. "Stop lying." Ethan's voice was cold. In the corner of the cradle, A faint shimmer caught his eye. He reached in and pulled out a small silver key, thin and delicate. Attached to it was a faded ribbon, the same deep crimson as the fabric that lined Maggie's writing desk. She hid everything in plain sight, Ethan murmured. Evelyn swallowed hard. What are you talking about? But Ethan was already moving. The walls of the corridor seemed to close in as they retraced their steps. The faint sound of ticking echoed again, not from the grandfather clock upstairs, but from within the walls themselves. A mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the house. With every step, the key in Ethan's hand felt heavier, colder. When they reached Maggie's study, Ethan's hands trembled as he opened the desk drawer. It was empty, but the bottom panel had scratches, tiny, deliberate marks around the edges. Without thinking, Ethan slipped the key into a nearly invisible slit. Click. The bottom of the drawer gave way, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were two things: a second locket and a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. The locket was identical to Maggie's, except this one wasn't cracked. Inside it was a photo, a young woman smiling, and in her arms a baby. Isaac. The envelope had one word written in Maggie's careful script. Isaac. A memory slammed into Ethan. He was a child, maybe 7, peeking through the railing as Maggie spoke to someone in the study. A man Ethan didn't recognize. I told you never to come here, Maggie hissed. I deserve to see him, the man snapped. You lost that right when you walked away. The man's voice softened. He's mine too, Margaret. Maggie's face twisted in rage. Not anymore. The door slammed. Ethan had forgotten. Till now. Ethan's mind spun. How much of his family's history was real? Had Daniel even been his true brother? Was Maggie protecting them or controlling them? He looked at Evelyn. Her pale face was unreadable. What aren't you telling me? He demanded. Evelyn flinched. I overheard Maggie once, she admitted. She spoke of a child before Daniel. But I thought it was a miscarriage, not this. Ethan didn't believe her. Not entirely. For years, Daniel had been the favored child, the golden boy. But what if he was only a stand-in, replacement? Maggie had always corrected anyone who called her grandma in public, insisting on Margaret. Was it pride? Or guilt? Maybe Daniel wasn't the heir she had planned for. Maybe Isaac had been. And Daniel was a shadow in Isaac's place. Ethan tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter. The handwriting was delicate but firm. Isaac, if you're reading this, it means I failed you. I tried to protect you from him, but the past is a beast that refuses to die. I locked the truth away, thinking it would save this family. But blood has a way of finding its own. Forgive me, Maggie. Below the letter was a map of the mansion. But not the mansion Ethan knew. Passages, rooms, and symbols marked places he had never seen. One was circled in red. The root cellar. Ethan stared at the map. The mansion was a labyrinth. And at its heart, buried beneath layers of stone and lies, was the root cellar. A place meant for storage. But what had Maggie stored there? Not wine. Not food. Secrets. Buried deep. Isaac. Ethan didn't wait. He stormed through the house, Evelyn struggling to keep up. They reached the cellar door. But the silver key fit perfectly. The door groaned as it opened, releasing a stale, earthy scent. The air was colder here, thicker. Steps descended into darkness. At the bottom, candlelight flickered. But there were no candles. Only rows of glass jars. Floating inside each. Dozens of them. Staring. Some were human. Some were not. In the corner of the cellar stood a figure. Face hidden in shadows. But Ethan knew. He didn't need to see the face. He knew. Isaac. The figure tilted its head, lowly, and smiled. Sometimes it's not the dead you need to fear. It's the living who refuse to stay buried. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure at the bottom of the cellar slowly emerged from the shadows. each step deliberate and unervingly calm. The flickering candlelight barely illuminated his face, but it was enough. It was like looking into a fractured mirror. Is it? Yet, not entirely human. Brother. The word rolled off Isaac's tongue like it was foreign, tasting it for the first time. Ethan's mind reeled. How could this be real? Maggie never mentioned another child. The family photos, so carefully arranged, never hinted at Isaac's existence. And yet here he was, standing before Ethan like a phantom from the past. Isaac's eyes glinted unnaturally, catching the dim light. Ethan's gaze drifted back to the jars on the shelves. Dozens of eyes. Human. Animal. Some unrecognizable. Were they trophies? Experiments? What did she do to you? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Isaac smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of his lips. She tried to forget me. But blood remembers. The air in the cellar was damp, suffocating. It smelled of mold and something metallic, like rusted iron. Or dried blood. The walls felt closer now, the stone pressing inward. Ethan could hear the faint sound of water dripping in the distance, echoing like a slow, steady heartbeat. Isaac stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the cold stone. Ethan instinctively stepped back, the creak of the wooden stairs betraying his unease. You were the replacement, Isaac murmured, tilting his head. Daniel was the golden boy, but you were always second. Ethan's grip tightened on the locket in his hand. You don't know anything about me. Isaac's grin widened. I know more than you think. A memory surfaced. Ethan as a boy, hiding behind the thick velvet curtains in Maggie's study. Maggie's voice, sharp and panicked. He can't know. No one can. A man's voice replied, cold and resolute. If you bury the past, Margaret, it will dig its way back up. The memory fractured, slipping through Ethan's fingers. Had Maggie truly been protecting them? Or hiding something more sinister? And Evelyn? Her half-truths? Her sudden appearances? Ethan's mind swirled with doubt. Was she guiding him toward the truth or away from it? A soft sound behind him made Ethan spin around. Evelyn stood at the top of the cellar stairs, pale and wide-eyed. Ethan, we need to leave. But Isaac chuckled. No, Evelyn. You brought him here, didn't you? Ethan turned slowly, disbelief crashing over him. No, Evelyn whispered, shaking her head. I didn't. Isaac's eyes locked onto hers. Lies run deep in this family. Ethan's thoughts raced. Had Evelyn led him here intentionally? Or was she, too, another pawn in Maggie's twisted game? The torn pages of Maggie's journals, Evelyn's sudden knowledge of hidden doors, the way she always appeared when Ethan was close to uncovering something. Was it coincidence? Or manipulation? Isaac took another step forward. Ethan instinctively raised the cracked locket, as if it could shield him. Isaac's eyes flickered to it, and for the first time his smile faltered. That doesn't belong to you, Isaac growled, his voice low and dangerous. Ethan tightened his grip. What is it? What did she hide in this? Isaac's expression darkened. Give it to me. No. The room seemed to close in. Isaac's breathing grew heavier, ragged. The walls around them groaned, as if the house itself was waking up. Ethan suddenly remembered Maggie's roses, always cut at the stem, never allowed to bloom. Was it symbolic of Isaac? A son never allowed to grow, locked away, cut off from the family tree. Isaac lunged. The force of Isaac's attack sent Ethan crashing into the shelves. Jars shattered, their contents spilling onto the stone floor with a sickening splatter. Isaac's hands closed around Ethan's throat, ice cold and inhumanly strong. Give it to me, Isaac roared. Ethan gasped, his free hand scrambling against the cold stone. His fingers brushed against something metal, a silver key. Without thinking, he drove it into Isaac's side. Isaac howled in pain, releasing him. Ethan staggered back, gasping for air. Isaac's blood wasn't red. It was black, and it sizzled on the floor like acid. Ethan's hand trembled. What are you? Isaac grinned, black blood dripping from his side. I'm what she made me. And then, from above, the sound of footsteps. Low, deliberate, descending the cellar stairs. Maggie's voice soft and cold. Enough games. The dead aren't the ones haunting this house. It's the living who carry the ghosts. The cellar was suffocating, every breath Ethan took scraping against his throat like sandpaper. The flickering candlelight stretched long, crooked shadows on the walls, dancing behind the figure slowly descending the steps. Maggie. Her frail form seemed untouched by the years, wrapped in a dark shawl, her silver hair a halo of menace. But it wasn't her frailty that unsettled Ethan. It was her expression. Cold. Controlled. Isaac, Maggie's voice was sharp but eerily calm. Stop this. Isaac snarled, clutching his bleeding side where Ethan had stabbed him with the silver key. His black blood oozed sluggishly, sizzling where it touched the stone floor. She brought you here to kill me, Isaac spat, gesturing toward Evelyn. Don't you see it, Ethan? We're both her puppets. Maggie didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on Ethan. In Maggie's hand was something Ethan hadn't noticed before. A small leather-bound book, its spine cracked and worn. The same book that had been missing from the study's locked drawer. Do you want answers? Maggie asked quietly. Or do you want more lies? Ethan's grip tightened on the locket, feeling the pulse of something hidden inside it. You don't get to ask questions. You locked Isaac away. You lied to all of us. Her gaze didn't waver. Because the truth is worse. The air thickened, the silence stretching unbearably between them. The flickering candlelight seemed to dim, casting the room in deeper shadow. A cold draft snaked through the cellar, carrying the faint scent of wilted flowers and damp stone. Isaac's heavy breathing echoed, mingling with the slow, deliberate creak of Maggie's steps. You think I wanted this? Maggie's voice softened, but there was a razor's edge to it. You think I chose any of this? She opened the book slowly, the pages brittle with age. The words inside weren't English. They were symbols, looping and jagged, written in dark ink that seemed to glisten. Blood. I did what was necessary. Ethan was pulled back into fragments of memories. Maggie in the garden, whispering to the roses as she clipped them at the stem. The locked room at the end of the hall, the doorknob cold to the touch. A child's scream, muffled and distant, echoing through the mansion's empty corridors. Ethan blinked, disoriented. Had those screams been real? Or the echoes of Isaac's past? Maggie's words seeped into his mind, clouding his judgment. They wanted to hurt us, Ethan. I stopped them. Isaac lunged forward, but Maggie raised the book. One word, harsh and guttural, slipped from her lips. Isaac froze mid-step, body rigid. His limbs trembled as if struggling against invisible chains. His face twisted in rage. You're not strong enough anymore, he growled. But Maggie only smiled faintly. I only need to be strong enough. Ethan's mind raced. The book, was it controlling Isaac? Or protecting them? Had Maggie been the monster? Or the gatekeeper holding something worse at bay? The symbols on the pages resembled the carvings on the cellar walls, marks Ethan had dismissed as mere cracks in the stone. They weren't random. They were seals, barriers, to keep something in. Not Isaac, something else. I bound him to this place, Maggie said softly, her eyes never leaving Ethan. Because he was never meant to exist. Isaac's face twisted in fury. You made me this. Maggie didn't deny it. You were born of blood and betrayal. I stopped the curse from spreading. I contained it. Ethan's hands trembled. What curse? Maggie's smile was cold. Our family is rooted in rot. Generation after generation, feeding on itself. Isaac was meant to end it. Cliffhanger or shocking revelation. The locket in Ethan's hand grew warm, almost burning. He snapped it open. Inside wasn't a photo. It was a tiny, jagged piece of bone, wrapped in black thread. Isaac's eyes widened in recognition and fear. You fool, he hissed. The ground beneath them trembled. Cracks split the stone floor, and from the darkness below, something ancient stirred. Maggie's face paled. For the first time she looked afraid. "You've undone the seal." The walls groaned as dust and stone rained down from above. The air grew colder, heavier. A voice, deep, guttural, not human, rumbled from beneath. "Free." Maggie's hands tightened around the book. "Run." But it was too late. The floor beneath them split open, and darkness swallowed the room whole. The greatest evil isn't what we bury, it's what we forget we buried. The floor was gone. Ethan plummeted through the darkness, his screams swallowed by the cold, endless void. The world spun, suffocating him in its black grip. Then, as suddenly as he had fallen, the ground met him with a bone-cracking force. He gasped, struggling to pull air into his lungs. Around him, the pitch-black void stretched infinitely, broken only by the dim, pulsating glow of ancient symbols etched into distant walls. Their crimson light throbbed like a heartbeat. Somewhere above, the sounds of crumbling stone faded into silence. He was alone, or so he thought. A faint whisper rippled through the darkness. Not words, breath. Ethan strained to hear, catching fragments. "It's awake. Sealed for a reason. The blood must feed." Ethan staggered to his feet, the locket in his hand still radiating heat. Its silver sheen was now tarnished, darkened by whatever power it had released. The piece of bone inside was gone, leaving behind only black ash. Ahead, something glimmered in the distance. Door. Massive, ancient, and covered in the same blood-red symbols that pulsed on the walls. It was cracked open, just enough for a thin, dark mist to slither out. The air was heavier here, thick with the scent of damp earth and something fouler, rotting flesh. Ethan's footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the darkness itself swallowed sound. Every breath felt like inhaling dust and decay. Something moved behind the door. Low. Deliberate. His mind flashed back to the whispers he'd heard as a child. "Don't play near the cellar, Ethan. That room was sealed for a reason." Maggie's cold warning. Some doors are never meant to be opened. Yet here he was, standing before the very door Maggie had feared. But had Maggie truly feared it? Or had she wanted him to open it all along? Ethan's grip on reality slipped. The ground beneath his feet pulsed, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was standing or sinking. A hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, heart hammering. "Is it?" Pale, gaunt, eyes wide with something close to terror. "She's here." Ethan's throat tightened. "Who?" Isaac didn't answer. Instead he pointed to the door. "She's waiting." The door groaned, opening a fraction wider. A gust of cold wind swept past them, carrying with it the soft sound of something wet dragging across stone. Maggie's voice echoed faintly. "Ethan, come here, dear." But it wasn't Maggie. Not really. Isaac grabbed Ethan's arm. "It's not her. It's never been her." Ethan hesitated, the familiar voice pulling at him. Was it truly Maggie? Had she fallen into this pit too? Or was something wearing her voice like a mask? The symbols on the door began to shift, slithering like living things. They rearranged themselves into shapes Ethan vaguely recognized. The family crest, a rose strangled by thorns. A warning. Or an invitation. Isaac's expression twisted. "She fed it. For years." "Yes." Ethan stared at him. "What are you talking about?" Isaac's voice was barely a whisper. "We were the sacrifice. Every generation. She just chose who lived. And who didn't. Maggie hadn't been protecting them. She'd been feeding the monster below." The door creaked fully open, revealing not a room but an abyss of shifting, writhing shadows. And within it a figure. Maggie. But not. Her eyes were pits of darkness, her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. Her skin was thin, as if stretched too tightly over something far larger beneath. In her hands she held the leather-bound book, but it was no longer old. It pulsed, alive, its pages flickering with shadows. "Welcome home, Ethan." Her voice was layered. Maggie's voice, and beneath it, something ancient. Something hungry. Isaac pulled Ethan back, but the ground trembled violently. From the darkness, countless hands began to emerge, clawing at the edges of the abyss. Pale, thin, grasping. The ancestors. The ones Maggie had protected. The ones she had sacrificed. Ethan's scream was lost in the deafening roar as the ground split open beneath them. It wasn't the darkness that scared me most. It was realizing the light had been a lie all along. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the suffocating silence pressed in around him. The stone chamber trembled with a low, guttural hum, a sound that seemed to come from within the very walls. Every surface pulsed faintly, as though the mansion itself was alive, breathing slowly in anticipation. Ethan tightened his grip on the cracked locket, its metal cold and slick in his palm. The echoes of Maggie's voice still lingered in his ears. You were always meant to find this place. But why? He scanned the chamber, the faint crimson glow of the symbols casting long, stretched shadows that seemed to reach for him. The door behind him had vanished, swallowed by the dark stone, leaving him stranded in this subterranean nightmare. Ethan took a cautious step forward, his boots grinding against the gritty stone. And then he heard it. Faint whisper. Not Maggie's. Not Isaac's. His own name, barely audible but unmistakable, floated through the thick air. Ethan. He spun around. Nothing but darkness. Yet the whisper came again, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Come closer. Ethan hesitated, scanning the walls. A faint glimmer caught his eye, a thin line of liquid seeping from the cracks, dark and slow-moving. It wasn't water. It gleamed in the dim light, viscous and unnatural. He knelt, staring at it. It was blood. His stomach churned. Following the trail, he noticed that the crimson substance led to a narrow, nearly invisible passageway carved into the stone. Etched along the walls were more symbols, crude and hastily carved, unlike the precise ones Maggie had used. And there, among the markings, something new. A single word scratched deeply into the rock. Liar. Ethan's pulse quickened. Was this a warning? Or a confession? The air grew colder as Ethan stepped into the passage, his breath forming clouds in the dim glow. The walls felt closer here, pressing in on him, as though the mansion itself sought to consume him. The stone beneath his hands felt damp, clammy like flesh. And that scent, something metallic sharp, filled his nostrils. Not just the blood. Something else. In the distance, the sound of something dragging across stone echoed faintly. Low. Deliberate. He wasn't alone. The coldness sparked a memory. Ethan, 6 years old, hiding under a heavy velvet tablecloth, listening to hushed voices in the parlor. She'll never tell them, a woman's voice hissed. She can't. If she does, everything falls apart. Then we make sure she doesn't, another voice murmured. One he recognized now. Maggie's. The child. Ethan had squeezed his eyes shut, holding his breath, thinking it was about someone else. But now, in this suffocating tunnel, he wasn't so sure. Was it ever about someone else? Or had it always been about him? A sudden thought clawed into his mind, unbidden. What if this was never Maggie's doing? The idea was absurd, yet it slithered in, refusing to leave. His memories were fractured, pieces missing where they shouldn't be. The locket in his hand. How long had he even had it? Was it his, or had it been placed in his possession? Had Maggie led him here, or had someone else been guiding his every step? The walls seemed to breathe in agreement. The narrow path led Ethan to a cavernous hall where the stone gave way to ancient wooden beams. Hanging from the rafters were faded, tattered banners bearing the family crest, once proud, now decayed. But what chilled him to his core were the portraits. Dozens of them, hung in uneven rows. Faces of ancestors, all eerily lifelike, their painted eyes seeming to follow him. And then he noticed it. The faces weren't painted. They were preserved. Skin stretched tight over bone, glassy eyes wide open in permanent terror. Ethan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Was this Maggie's work? Or had this horror predated her? From the shadows a figure moved. Ethan. Is it? But something was wrong. His eyes hollowed too dark. I tried to stop it, Isaac rasped, voice cracked. But you brought it here. What are you talking about? Ethan demanded, backing away. Isaac extended a trembling hand, pointing to the locket. That's not a key. It's a tether. Ethan looked down at the locket. It felt heavier now, pulsing faintly. Isaac smiled, a thin, unnatural curve. She never had control. You did. The ground shuddered beneath them. The locket cracked open in his hand, revealing something Ethan hadn't seen before. Mirror. And in it, his reflection didn't move. It stared back at him, grinning. A violent tremor split the ground, and from the shadows a voice. His own spoke. You were always meant to replace her. The walls began to bleed, the portraits melting into the stone. And the locket burned in Ethan's palm, refusing to let go. Sometimes the truth doesn't just set you free. It chains you to a fate worse than the lies. The silence in the cavernous room was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of Ethan's pulse. His hand clutched the locket tighter, the glassy reflection of his own face still staring back at him. He wanted to drop it, to hurl it into the abyss that lay at his feet, but something stopped him. Something dark, pressing against the pit of his stomach. What have I done? The realization came like a hammer blow. His mind raced, grasping at the fragments of his past, trying to piece together the twisted puzzle of what had led him here. Had Maggie been telling the truth? Or had he been the one trapped in a web of deception all along? The cold air around him seemed to thicken, swirling in a vortex of unanswered questions. A faint whisper curled around him, almost like a beckoning. Find the truth, Ethan. But there was no clarity, no answer. Only a deepening void. Ethan stumbled backward, heart racing, as the portrait of the rotting ancestor seemed to watch him. He wanted to turn away, but the atmosphere in the room held him captive. His eyes were drawn to a series of old handwritten letters scattered across the floor. Some were torn, their edges curling with age, but others were preserved with careful precision. They seemed out of place here, surrounded by decay and death. Curiosity gnawed at him. He stepped forward, the dry sound of parchment crackling beneath his boots. He gingerly picked up the nearest letter, squinting at the faded ink. The handwriting was familiar. Too familiar. Ethan, the path you tread is not yours to choose. You walk in the footsteps of those who came before you, but they have all failed. His breath caught in his throat. The letter was addressed to him. But how? Why? As he read further, it became clear that the words held no answer, only more questions. The letter hinted at something terrible hidden beneath the mansion's foundation. A family secret carefully buried, now clawing its way to the surface. A sudden crash echoed behind him. He whirled around, heart hammering, but the room was empty, save for the oppressive silence. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him. The room felt too cold, too oppressive. Ethan's breath was visible in the air, his skin prickling with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The scent of dust and old wood mixed with something heavier, something metallic. He instinctively reached for his shirt collar, as if to relieve the pressure on his chest. The old grandfather clock at the far end of the room began to tick louder, each beat like a thunderclap, reverberating through the stone walls. It had always been an eerie sound, but now it was different. It seemed to grow, to swell, until it was all-consuming, drowning out everything else. Ethan's eyes darted to the clock. The hands were frozen, but the tick was still there, slow and deliberate. He took a step toward the clock, his feet dragging through the dust. The ticking intensified, each second echoing in his ears like a warning. Ethan's mind slipped again, the edges of reality warping like a film reel out of sync. He was a child again. The smell of wet earth and fresh rain. His mother's voice, soft and reassuring, telling him to run inside. "Don't go near the cellar, Ethan." Not tonight. But he had gone. Of course he had. Children always did the things they were told not to. Ethan had wandered into the cellar that night, drawn by the sound of whispers. His own name, coming from deep below. His small hand trembling on the rusted doorknob, the cold metal seeming to bite into his skin. What he had found there would haunt him for years to come. The present and past bled together as Ethan wrestled with the confusion gnawing at him. Was it really Maggie's fault? Was she just another player in a game that was far bigger than he'd ever realized? Or had he been the one pulling the strings all along? He clenched his fists, his mind racing to untangle the threads of his memories. Everything felt off. The locket, the letters, the sudden, inexplicable pull he felt toward the mansion's secrets. Was it me? The question echoed through his thoughts, an insistent whisper that refused to be ignored. He had trusted Maggie, had believed her when she said she was only trying to protect him. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, it was clear. She had been lying to him too. Or was he the liar? The ground shifted beneath him, a tremor running through the floorboards. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as a distant rumble grew louder. The sound of something massive, alive, almost moving within the walls. The whispers intensified. "It's too late, Ethan." The shadows lengthened, stretching toward him like hungry hands. He stumbled backward, his mind spiraling into panic. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air thick with dread. This wasn't just about Maggie anymore. It never had been. A noise erupted, sharp and violent, a door slamming open somewhere in the distance. Ethan spun toward the sound, but there was nothing there, only the yawning emptiness of the mansion's corridors. He spun again, almost losing his balance as his gaze fell on something unexpected, a familiar face in the doorway. Daniel. But it couldn't be him. Not here. Not now. "Ethan," Daniel's voice was hollow, stripped of warmth. "You've made a terrible mistake." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Had Daniel been hiding in the mansion all along? Had he known more about the curse than anyone? Was Daniel here to confront him or to push him further into the darkness? But when Ethan reached out to him, Daniel's figure vanished, slipping back into the shadows. And the mansion trembled. As the floor shook beneath him, a new vision flashed before Ethan's eyes. It was quick, so fast he could barely grasp it. A family portrait disfigured beyond recognition with one face. His face, scratched out entirely. A chill of realization crept up his spine. His family, his bloodline, it had all led to this. The curse, the mansion, the endless cycle of lies. Ethan turned to the broken clock, his chest tight. The hands moved now. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were moving. And the ticking. It didn't stop. "You're too late, Ethan." The voice came from the shadows. And this time it wasn't Maggie's voice. It was his own. The truth was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The mansion had been waiting for him all along. Every mirror reflects the truth, but sometimes it shows what should have remained hidden. Ethan stood paralyzed in front of the massive, dust-covered mirror in the forgotten hallway. The surface was clouded with age, its silver frame tarnished and cracked, yet it still held a haunting glimmer. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong. It wasn't his eyes looking at him. It was something deeper, colder. He took a cautious step forward. His reflection didn't move. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if time itself slowed around him. Ethan's breath became shallow. That isn't me. The thought clawed at the edges of his mind. Then the reflection smiled. The mirror was no ordinary one. Its frame was etched with symbols Ethan couldn't recognize, though they felt disturbingly familiar. As his eyes traced the carvings, he noticed something embedded in the bottom corner. An insignia. The same insignia burned into the back of the locket. How had he missed it before? A sudden thought gripped him. The mirror is a door. His pulse quickened as he reached out, fingertips grazing the icy glass. A faint vibration pulsed beneath the surface, like a heartbeat, steady and slow. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed something else. A second reflection, standing just behind him in the glass. A figure cloaked in shadow. He spun around. Nothing. Yet in the mirror the figure remained. The walls around him seemed to groan, the wallpaper peeling like decaying skin. The air smelled of mildew and something else, iron and rot. The oppressive quiet was broken only by a low hum, vibrating deep within the walls. Ethan's hand trembled as he touched the mirror again, colder than before. His breath fogged the glass, but the figure behind him didn't. It was still unmoving. The mirror's hum grew louder. A sudden flash of movement in the glass made him flinch. The figure was closer now, directly behind his shoulder. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. I need to get out of here. But the hallway stretched endlessly behind him. No matter how many steps he took, the door remained impossibly distant. The mansion was shifting. A sharp pain pierced his temple. The memory was sudden, vivid. Ethan, much younger, standing before this very mirror. Maggie's reflection behind him, her hands on his shoulders. Don't look too long, Ethan. The mirror doesn't like to be stared at. Her tone had been casual, but her grip was bruising. A glimpse of Maggie carving something into the mirror's frame late at night. Whispering words he couldn't understand. The reflection grinning at him as a child, just like it did now. Ethan's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold floor. His mind spun. Was any of this real? He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the images to stop. But when he opened them, the figure in the mirror was gone. Or had it ever been there at all? He couldn't trust himself. The mansion was toying with him, feeding on his uncertainty. Or worse, maybe it wasn't the mansion at all. Maybe it was him. Determined to break free from the suffocating grip of the mirror's pull, Ethan turned away, but the hallway was gone. In its place stood a corridor of mirrors, stretching endlessly in both directions. Each pane shimmered with faint movement. His reflection fractured into 1,000 versions of himself, each one subtly wrong. Some smiled. Others cried. One slowly raised a knife. Panic surged through him. A soft voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere. Choose the right path or be lost forever. Ethan spun in place. Which way was forward? Which was back? Every step he took, the reflections grew more distorted. Then a sound of faint tapping. Looking closer, he saw one of his reflections tapping on the glass, lips moving silently. It was trying to warn him. Desperation overtook logic. Ethan lunged toward the tapping reflection, believing it to be guiding him. But as his hand neared the glass, the reflection's face twisted into a sinister grin, eyes black as coal. Too late. The glass shattered, pulling Ethan through. He landed hard, coughing, blinking against a blinding white light. He was back in the mansion's grand hall, but it was pristine, perfect, as if untouched by time. And standing at the top of the staircase was Maggie, smiling. Ethan, you're home. His mind reeled. Whoa. This isn't real. But the scent of freshly baked bread, the warmth of the fire, it all felt too vivid. Was it a memory? Or a lie? Behind Maggie hung the family portrait. Except now, every face was turned toward Ethan, smiling. Except his own. His image in the painting had been scratched out entirely. The same way the figure in the mirror had looked. Maggie's voice echoed from above. You've always been part of this house, Ethan. You just forgot. The chandelier above him swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The shadows beneath it lengthened unnaturally. Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands. Blood. Fresh and warm, dripping from his fingertips. But he hadn't been hurt. Slowly he turned his hands over. Clutched in his palm was a shard of the mirror. And in its reflection the figure stared back, its face finally visible. It was Ethan. But not the Ethan standing in the room. This version of him whispered a single, chilling word. Run. Before the walls around him began to collapse. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But what happens when one opens on its own? Ethan's breath hitched as the walls trembled around him. The mirror's shard still trembled in his bloodied hand, its cold surface reflecting a version of himself he no longer recognized. The house groaned as if awakening from a deep slumber. Then, without warning, a door appeared at the end of the hall. A door Ethan was certain had never been there before. It was impossibly tall, made of dark wood with veins of silver running through it like cracks in ice. Its iron handle seemed to pulse, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. "It's calling me." Ethan hesitated. Then he noticed something carved into the frame of the door, faint, almost invisible under the dust. "To enter is to remember. To remember is to lose." His mind reeled. The words weren't unfamiliar. He had heard them before. In a forgotten lullaby. Grandmother used to sing that. But why? He ran his fingers along the carvings, and a soft hum vibrated under his skin. As his hand neared the handle, a flicker of light caught his eye. Carved into the iron was the same insignia from the locket and the mirror. 3 clues. 1 symbol. The air around the door felt colder, heavier. A draft snaked around Ethan's ankles, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. Blood or rust, he couldn't tell. The silence deepened. The hallway behind him seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering sconces casting long, twisted shadows. Ethan slowly grasped the handle. It was warm. He turned it. The door groaned open, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow light whole. This place. It shouldn't exist. But his feet moved forward anyway. The darkness enveloped him, but flashes of memory pierced through like lightning. A child's laughter. His own. Maggie's voice, soft yet stern. "Never go past the 3rd door, Ethan." A hidden key in a jewelry box. A key that didn't fit any lock in the house. A cold hand on his shoulder. But no one was there. The room slowly took shape as his eyes adjusted. It was circular, the walls lined with shelves overflowing with old books, trinkets, and jars filled with unidentifiable objects. The ceiling stretched high above him, vanishing into darkness. At the center stood a wooden table, and on it a single item. Photograph. Ethan approached cautiously. It was a picture of him as a child, standing beside Maggie. But Maggie's face was wrong. Blurry, smudged, as though someone had tried to erase it. Ethan's own face was scratched out. Yet something about the photo chilled him more than the missing faces. In the background of the photo was the very room he now stood in. How is that possible? He turned the photo over. On the back, in elegant, slanted handwriting, "He is watching." A sound broke the suffocating silence. Scraping. From the shadows beyond the shelves. Ethan turned, heart hammering. The darkness seemed to thicken. Shapes moved, just beyond the reach of the dim light. A whisper echoed, impossibly close. "You shouldn't be here." He backed away from the table, but his foot struck something. A small wooden box lay on the floor, cracked open. Inside bones. Tiny, brittle, and unmistakably human. His breath quickened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Maggie. But not Maggie. Her face was pale and stretched thin, eyes hollow, skin paper-thin over jagged bones. She wore the same brooch Ethan had seen in the family portraits. But this wasn't his grandmother. She smiled. "Looking for me, dear?" Ethan stumbled back, gripping the mirror shard tighter. The figure laughed softly, tilting its head. "No need to run." "Not yet." It stepped forward, revealing a glimmering key hanging from a chain around its neck. The same key from his childhood. "You've forgotten so much, Ethan. Let me remind you." Ethan's eyes darted back to the shelves. He now noticed patterns. Books stacked to form symbols. Objects placed deliberately. A locket, a withered rose, a rusted knife. All things he had encountered before. The room was a map. and Maggie was its guardian. But something deeper clicked in Ethan's mind. This room was built to hide something. Not from the family, but from Maggie herself. The figure smiled, running skeletal fingers along the shelves. I kept this family safe, Ethan. Do you know what happens when secrets die? Her voice softened. Yes, I simply preserved what mattered. She clutched the key tighter. But you were always curious. Like your mother. Ethan's blood ran cold. What did you do to her? The figure chuckled. I only gave her the truth. It's not my fault she couldn't bear it. Rage flared in Ethan's chest. The figure extended the key toward him. Do you want the truth, Ethan? Or would you rather stay in the dark? Ethan reached for the key, but the figure jerked it back, laughing. But you must choose carefully. Some doors can't be closed once opened. The shelves began to tremble, books toppling. From the shadows, more figures emerged. Half seen, half formed. Whispers filled the air. Choose. 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 Ethan's grip tightened on the mirror shard, and he lunged. Not every monster hides in the shadows. Some sit beside you at the dinner table. The echo of Ethan's scream seemed to dissolve into the suffocating silence that followed. His hand trembled, blood slick on the mirror shard clenched between his fingers. The figure of Maggie, or whatever nightmare wore her face, had vanished into the suffocating darkness of the hidden room. But the threat hadn't left with her. The walls of the mansion seemed to breathe. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the candlelight whispered of secrets that refused to stay buried. And then the house groaned. The doors to the dining room slowly swung open. The long dining table was set for a feast that would never be eaten. Platters of untouched food sat cold, the silverware perfectly aligned. Yet something was off. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Every chair was occupied by the family, but they weren't moving. Daniel slumped in his chair, a glass of wine tipped over. Aunt Meredith sat stiffly, eyes vacant, fingers wrapped unnaturally around her napkin. Even Cousin Clara sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth. It wasn't the stillness that sent a chill through Ethan. It was their smiles. Too wide, and far too still. The candle flames barely flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The air was thick, choking with the scent of overripe fruit and rotting meat. Ethan's stomach churned. The room was far too quiet, the ticking of the grandfather clock suddenly deafening in its regularity. Yet none of them moved. Then a sound, a slow, deliberate scraping. Ethan's gaze snapped to the head of the table. The high-backed chair turned. Maggie. But not the figure from the hidden room. This Maggie looked real. Solid. Composed. Alive. Flesh. A child's hand slipping into Maggie's as she hummed a lullaby. Flesh. A dinner table, laughter echoing, Maggie raising a toast. But in the corner of the room, a locked cabinet ignored. Flesh. A scream cut off. The same table. Tea plates. And silence. Ethan dear, why are you standing? Maggie's voice was smooth, almost sweet. She gestured to an empty seat. You're letting the food get cold. Ethan stared at her, throat tight. This wasn't right. None of this was right. But the part that terrified him most was the flicker of familiarity in her voice. He blinked. Was she, smiling kindly? No, this was another trick. Wasn't it? Ethan didn't move. You look pale, my dear. Sit, Maggie's voice sharpened, though her smile never faltered. He took a hesitant step back, but a sudden noise made him freeze. Clink. The sound of cutlery. One by one, the family members began to move. Slow, mechanical. Daniel lifted his glass, crimson liquid dripping from his lips, but it wasn't wine. Meredith's head turned unnaturally far to the side, staring at Ethan with hollow eyes. Clara's fork finally reached her mouth, but she didn't eat. She smiled. Ethan's eyes darted across the table. The plates were empty, but the knives and forks were arranged in the same pattern as the family crest. A serpent coiled around a rose. Maggie's brooch. the mirror's frame, the locket, always the serpent and the rose. His gaze locked on the tablecloth. Dark stains bled through the white fabric. Not wine. Blood. Maggie rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress. This family was broken long before me, Ethan. I merely kept it together. Her eyes glinted. Would you rather I let them tear each other apart? Secrets are dangerous when left unattended. Ethan's grip on the mirror shard tightened. What did you do to them? Her expression softened. I saved them. Her hand motioned to the unmoving family. They just don't know it yet. Daniel's lips suddenly moved. But the words weren't his. Join us, Ethan. The voices merged. Daniel, Meredith, Clara, all speaking in unison. We forgive you. Ethan shook his head violently. Whoa. This isn't real. But the words planted a seed of doubt. Was it Maggie speaking through them? Or was it them? Maggie tilted her head, studying him. You still don't understand, do you? Her hand slid into her pocket, pulling out something small and glinting. The same key Ethan had seen in the hidden room. But this one was different. It was blackened, burned, the serpent and rose barely visible. This unlocks the final door. She placed it delicately on the table, sliding it toward him. But beware, my dear. What you find behind it may not be what you're looking for. The family's heads all turned to him in perfect unison. And they smiled. Some doors are meant to stay closed. But what if it was never locked? Ethan stared at the blackened key lying on the blood-stained table. The serpent coiled around the rose glistened in the dim candlelight, half melted into the metal as if scorched by fire. His hand twitched at his side, the mirror shard biting into his palm. Maggie's eyes never left him, cold and expectant. The family still sat frozen, their hollow smiles stretched wide as if waiting, no daring him to reach for the key. Ethan's breath slowed. The air around him thickened. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something worse. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a choice. It was a summons. His gaze flicked to the far end of the dining room. A door he hadn't noticed before stood slightly ajar, swallowed by shadows. Strange symbols etched into the wood shimmered faintly under the flickering candlelight. The serpent and the rose. Again. But beneath it, a phrase in Latin. Meminus ardet. The words clawed at the edge of his memory. He had seen this before, in the margins of Maggie's diary, half erased, barely legible. What did Maggie not want him to remember? The room's silence began to hum, a low vibration that seemed to pulse from the walls. The air turned colder, heavy with a metallic scent of blood and something more bitter, ash. Ethan's skin prickled as though invisible eyes crawled over him. The candles flickered violently, casting warped shadows that danced along the walls. Each figure at the table seemed to blur for a heartbeat, their still forms almost breathing. The scraping of silverware echoed unnaturally, stretching long into the silence. Ethan as a boy, peering through a crack in a door. Maggie arguing with someone, her face twisted in fury, the words too muffled to hear. A woman sobbing in the darkness. A hand, Maggie's hand, pressing something into young Ethan's palm. Hide it. Forget it. For all our sakes. A scorched piece of paper. The words burned away except for one, Meminus. Ethan's grip on the mirror shard loosened, his mind swimming. Had he been here before? Had he opened that door once already? No, that couldn't be. Could it? Maggie's voice slithered into the fog of his thoughts. You've always known, Ethan. You've just refused to remember. But was that true? Or just another of her manipulations? His memory fractured, pieces scattered like broken glass. Had he been protecting himself from the truth? Or protecting the family? The door at the far end of the room groaned open a little further. The cold that spilled out was unnatural, deeper than any draft. It gnawed at Ethan's bones. Go on, Maggie urged softly, voice dripping with false sweetness. Open it. Face what you've hidden. The family turned to him in unison, heads tilting unnaturally, their eyes hollow. Remember, Ethan, they spoke together, voices flat and inhuman. Ethan's hand moved on its own, grasping the blackened key. The metal burned ice-cold against his skin. As he stepped closer to the door, Ethan noticed something carved into the frame. Timeline. Some scratched out, others left intact. His birth date. Daniel's birth date. And below, a date that hadn't come yet. Tomorrow. Ethan's throat tightened. A date for something yet to happen. Or something that must. Maggie's voice floated through the air, silk-wrapped steel. Locks keep things out, Ethan. But sometimes they're meant to keep things in. Her smile was thin, tired. I wasn't always cruel. I was necessary. Ethan shook his head, but doubt gnawed at him. Necessary for what? Her eyes darkened. To keep the worst parts of this family buried. And now, he demanded. Maggie's voice softened. Now it's your turn. He fit the key into the lock. For a moment nothing happened. Then a scream, raw and primal, split the silence. Ethan's body locked in place. But it wasn't coming from beyond the door. It was behind him. He spun around. Maggie hadn't moved. Neither had the family. But the scream continued. His own voice. It was coming from inside the walls. The door swung open. Darkness swallowed the room beyond, impossibly vast. Ethan stepped forward, heart pounding. A single light flickered in the distance. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. Mirror. But not just any mirror. It was him. Bound to a chair, staring back at him with wild, terrified eyes. His reflection screamed silently, mouth moving, but no sound escaped. Then, in the reflection, a figure appeared behind him. Maggie. But this Maggie was different. Younger. Crying. Whispering. Some things are better forgotten. The door slammed shut behind him. Darkness pressed in. And Ethan understood. He hadn't come here to uncover the truth. He'd come to remember. And it was far worse than he could have imagined. The worst prison is the one you build for yourself. Ethan's breath hitched as the door sealed shut behind him, plunging him into suffocating darkness. The air was heavier here, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. Silence wasn't silent anymore. It pulsed, hummed, whispered. In front of him, the mirror glimmered faintly in the void. His own reflection stared back, wide-eyed, trembling and yet smiling. Well, that wasn't his smile. The reflection's lips moved without him, forming words he couldn't hear. Then a sound. A voice that wasn't his own. It was always you, Ethan. Ethan's eyes scanned the frame of the mirror. Symbols were etched into the glass, the same serpent coiled around a rose, but fractured, splintering like spiderweb cracks. Blood-red petals scattered along the cracks, dripping into the floor, disappearing into the dark. And then he saw them. Faint fingerprints smeared along the surface, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. His mind reeled. Whose prints were those? Were they his? Or someone else's? The cold here wasn't natural. It seeped into his bones, into his mind, making his thoughts sluggish. The darkness seemed to breathe around him, exhaling a damp, rotting scent. Ethan could hear the faint scratching. No tapping coming from the other side of the mirror. Slow, deliberate. Each beat synced with his heart, as if something behind the glass was waiting for him to answer. The silence wasn't empty. It was expectant. A child's laughter in the garden. Maggie's voice, soft and brittle. Never go beyond the roses, Ethan. But he had. The forbidden room. A figure, was it Daniel? Standing in front of the same mirror. His hand pressed flat against the glass. Whispering to it. Or listening. A name, spoken in a voice not his own. Eleanor. The name felt familiar but foreign. A name never spoken in this house. Who was Eleanor? Ethan's grip on the mirror shard tightened, the jagged glass cutting deeper into his palm. Yet he didn't feel the pain. Was this real? Had he even opened the door? What if he had never left the dining room? What if this was exactly where Maggie wanted him to be all along? The reflection smirked, tilting its head. It raised its hand. His hand, but with slow, deliberate defiance, the reflection dragged its nails across its own throat. No blood, just the sound of glass scraping. Set me free. But Ethan hadn't moved. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Scratch. The reflection's grin widened, unnatural, teeth too white, too sharp. The mirror vibrated as though something behind it was trying to break through. Then cracks formed. A thin, jagged fracture snaked its way down the glass. From within, his heart pounded in his chest. Would breaking it free the truth? Or something far worse? Maggie's voice slithered back into his head. Not everything broken needs fixing. The serpent around the rose was no longer dormant. It moved, coiling tighter, crushing the flower until its petals blackened and withered. The stem snapped. The serpent uncoiled. At the bottom of the mirror frame, an inscription revealed itself in the crawling light. What you see is not always what is there. Below it more dates, not scratched out this time, but added. One date. Tomorrow. The reflection spoke again, this time in Maggie's voice. I locked it away for you. For us. The voice softened, almost tender. But you wanted to remember. You forced my hand. Ethan shook his head violently. Oh, you lied. You twisted everything. Did I? Or did you ask me to? And for a terrible moment, Ethan wasn't sure. His hand lifted involuntarily, the mirror shard gleaming in the dark. Was it his decision? Or was something guiding him? He'd spent so long blaming Maggie. But what if this wasn't her doing? What if the family wasn't cursed? What if he was the curse? A distant sob echoed behind the mirror. Faint. Childlike. Ethan, please. A girl's voice. Eleanor. Or was it another trick? Without thinking, Ethan smashed the mirror shard into the glass. The mirror didn't break. It shattered inward, the shards dissolving into smoke. And behind it wasn't another room. It was him, bound to a chair. Eyes wide, mouth stitched shut with thorny vines. Blood weeping from the corners of his lips. The bound Ethan looked up slowly, pain and rage burning in his eyes. Behind him, Maggie stood, younger, sobbing, holding the same blackened key. You made me do this. The vines tightened, and the reflection spoke with his voice. It's your turn now. The ground gave way. Ethan fell. The house was no longer silent. It was listening. Ethan froze at the base of the staircase, his breath shallow. He felt it before he heard it. A soft creaking, deliberate and slow, like someone treading carefully above him. The Whitmore estate had always been quiet, but now that silence felt suffocating, as if the very walls were holding their breath. His mind flashed back to the attic, to the locked room he had dared to open. The ropes, the claw marks, and the photo of a child smiling up at him, all burned into his memory. But it wasn't the contents of the room that haunted him. It was the feeling that something else had been in there with him. Ethan slowly ascended the staircase, each step groaning under his weight. The old mansion's dim lighting flickered as though struggling to hold back the darkness creeping in from every corner. A draft slithered along the walls, bringing with it the faint scent of roses, wilted and rotting. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched endlessly, doors lining each side like silent sentinels. He hesitated, his hand grazing the wallpaper. Beneath the faded patterns, something rough scratched against his fingertips. Peeling the paper back, Ethan's stomach tightened. Symbols etched into the wood, winding like serpents intertwined with thorny vines. Some of them were fresh. Why would Maggie carve these here, he thought, tracing the lines. His grandmother's obsession with control now seemed more like a ritual. From behind one of the doors, a soft thudding sound echoed. A rhythmic knock, 3 times, then silence. Then again. The sound came from Maggie's old study. Ethan hadn't dared enter since she died. Swallowing hard, he pushed the door open. The study was untouched, preserved as though Maggie still lived. Dust motes swirled in the thin shafts of light breaking through the heavy curtains. Books lined the shelves, thick, ancient volumes, some without titles. Ethan's eyes drifted to the grand oak desk. Papers lay scattered, but one sheet had been carefully placed on top. It was a letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. His mother's. "I cannot protect him anymore, Mother." He's starting to remember. The dreams are bleeding into his waking hours. Ethan's pulse quickened. His mother had written to Maggie, warning her about him. But why? Behind the desk, a cabinet door hung ajar. Inside, more letters, all in the same trembling script. Each one more desperate than the last. He saw Eleanor again. He described the garden. "The one you told me was burned years ago. If he finds out what you did, what we all did, it will destroy him." Ethan staggered back, his breath ragged. His own mother had feared him. Or feared what he might uncover. A faint giggle broke the silence. Ethan spun around, but the room was empty. The sound had been close, too close. He glanced at the large mirror on the wall. His reflection stared back, but behind him, the reflection showed a shadow standing in the corner. Figure. Small, with a porcelain doll hanging limply from its hand. He turned sharply, but the corner was empty. Yet the air was colder here. The scent of roses was stronger. A mirror. Ethan turned back. The figure was gone, but words were now fogged onto the glass, as if breathed onto it. "She's waiting." His throat tightened. "Eleanor." The memory surfaced unbidden, a flash from childhood. Ethan, barely 8, standing in the garden. Maggie's voice sharp and cold, warning him not to stray near the locked gate. Beyond it, a little girl in white watching him from behind the iron bars. Her curls bouncing as she tilted her head. "Do you want to play, Ethan?" she'd whispered. He had forgotten that moment. Or had it been taken from him? "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't real." But the line between memory and hallucination had blurred. Had Maggie been protecting him from Eleanor? Or was she hiding Eleanor from him? He couldn't trust his own memories anymore. Ethan's hands trembled as he pocketed the letter. He needed answers, and only one place remained unexplored: the garden. The garden gate was rusted but unlocked. The iron groaned as Ethan pushed it open, the overgrown path swallowing his footsteps. Dead roses clung to the trellises, their thorns like twisted claws. The air here was heavier, as if untouched by time. In the center stood a stone well, its bricks crumbling. Something was carved along its rim. Ethan leaned closer, brushing away the moss. "We all fall down." A nursery rhyme. A warning. A soft rustle made him freeze. From behind the well, a figure slowly emerged. A girl in a tattered white dress. Eleanor. But she wasn't a child anymore. Her face was pale, stretched thin, and her eyes were dark hollows. The doll in her hand dangled limply, its head shattered. "You left me here," she whispered, her voice distant, fractured. "But now I remember." Ethan stumbled back. "Oh, you're not real." Eleanor tilted her head, smiling. "Neither are you." The ground trembled beneath Ethan's feet. Cracks splintered through the stone path, and the air thickened with the scent of burning roses. From the well a hand, pale, thin, and clawed, began to rise. Not Eleanor's. Someone else. Maggie. But younger. And smiling. "Welcome back, Ethan." Darkness surged upward, swallowing the garden whole. "I should have never come back here." Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the heavy, suffocating air around him. The garden was gone, devoured by the creeping darkness that had spilled from the ancient well. Maggie's younger self had vanished into the black, leaving only the echo of her chilling words behind. Ethan's legs trembled as he backed away, his mind spinning. Yet the ground beneath him didn't feel like soil anymore. It was colder, firmer. Stone. When he turned, the garden was gone. He now stood in a narrow stone corridor, the walls damp and uneven, carved by hands long gone. Dim, flickering light danced along the walls, but there was no visible source. Shadows stretched unnaturally far, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. Ethan wasn't sure if he had fallen, been dragged, or willingly crossed into this place. But he knew one thing: this was beneath the house, beneath the garden. The Whitmore family had buried more than secrets here. Ethan forced his breathing to slow. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, masking the distant, hollow dripping of water. Or was it something else? He moved forward cautiously. The passageway stretched endlessly, but soon the walls began to shift. Symbols, familiar and unsettling, were etched deep into the stone, identical to those he'd seen behind the peeling wallpaper upstairs. They were older here, more deliberate. Intertwined with the markings were names. His eyes froze on one. Eleanor Whitmore. Beneath it another. Ethan Whitmore. His breath caught in his throat. His name, carved into the stone, aged as if it had been there for centuries. But how? Is this a warning or a prophecy, he wondered. A chill raced down his spine. As Ethan pressed forward, the corridor opened into a cavernous underground chamber. Dim candlelight flickered along the walls, revealing countless mirrors. Some stood upright, others hung crookedly, and a few were shattered. Each one reflected not Ethan but warped versions of himself, smiling, crying, or standing completely still when he moved. The air was colder here. The scent of decaying roses lingered, thicker now, clinging to his skin. In the center of the room, a large mirror stood untouched. Its gilded frame was ornately carved with twisting vines and roses. Ethan felt drawn to it, unable to look away. But this mirror didn't reflect him. It reflected the study upstairs. And in that reflection, Maggie sat calmly at her desk, writing. But Maggie was dead. Suddenly, Ethan was yanked into a memory. He was 6 again, sitting on Maggie's lap. Her arms were tight around him, too tight. If you see her, Ethan, you mustn't speak to her, Maggie had warned, her voice honey-sweet but laced with steel. She's not who you think she is. Who, Grandma? He'd asked, but Maggie only smiled, brushing his hair back. The one in the mirror. The memory vanished as suddenly as it had come. Ethan stumbled back, blinking. Maggie's words echoed in his head. The one in the mirror. His reflection smiled at him. But he wasn't smiling. No, no, Ethan muttered. I'm awake. But doubt gnawed at him. His memories, his thoughts, they didn't belong to him anymore. Were these even his memories? Or were they Maggie's or Eleanor's, twisting into his mind? Was he awake? Or still dreaming? The mirror rippled like water. Hand reached out. Ethan stumbled backward, but the hand didn't follow. It pressed flat against the glass, pale and thin. A face emerged slowly, lips moving, though no sound came through. It was Eleanor, but not as the child he remembered. She was older now, her eyes hollow, her skin stretched thin like wax. Her mouth formed words. Help me. Ethan hesitated. Was this another trap? Or was Eleanor a victim too? The glass fractured slightly under her touch. A thin line of cracks spread outward. Then Ethan heard footsteps behind him. Deliberate. Low. He turned. Maggie stood there. Not the old woman he remembered, but the younger version he'd seen rising from the well. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light. I told you not to come here, Ethan, she whispered. But her voice was layered, like two voices speaking at once. Hers and something older, something darker. Now we can't let you leave. The candles snuffed out, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. Then came the sound of glass shattering. And Eleanor's scream. What if the mirrors were never meant to reflect, but to imprison? The sound of shattering glass still echoed in Ethan's ears, mingling with Eleanor's distant, agonized scream. The suffocating darkness clung to him like a second skin, swallowing every breath, every thought. Ethan's chest heaved as he frantically searched for light, for anything to anchor him to reality. But there was only the sound of something moving, something slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. Crunch. His foot shifted, grinding shards of glass beneath him. Ethan froze. The mirror had shattered, but he wasn't sure which one. Was it the one Eleanor had appeared in? Or another? The air thickened, oppressive and heavy with the scent of decaying roses and something metallic, blood. Was that Eleanor's scream? Or someone else's, he thought, his mind spiraling. As Ethan's eyes slowly adjusted, a faint glimmer caught his attention. A thin sliver of light pulsed in the distance, a rhythmic flicker like a heartbeat. Drawn toward it, he moved cautiously, glass crunching beneath his steps. The source of the light was a fractured mirror, its surface spiderwebbed with cracks. Unlike the others, this one didn't reflect him at all. Instead, it showed a narrow staircase descending further into darkness. But what unsettled him most wasn't the staircase. It was the figure at the bottom of it. Maggie. But this wasn't the young, vibrant woman he'd seen earlier. This Maggie was older, frail, yet unervingly aware. She stared directly at him through the mirror, her eyes gleaming with a cold, knowing smile. In her hand, she held something small and glinting, a key. Maggie slowly raised it, then dropped it. The key hit the stone floor with a deafening clang, and vanished. Ethan's skin prickled. The chamber around him felt alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. Faint whispers seemed to crawl along the stone, unintelligible but insistent. He hesitated, knowing the mirror was a trap. But every fiber of him screamed to move forward. If the key is real, where did it fall? The stone floor beneath his feet seemed to stretch and shift. The crack in the mirror widened, and suddenly, the glass didn't seem like glass at all. It was water. No, not water. Gateway. Without fully realizing it, Ethan reached out. The surface was cold, slick, and gave way beneath his touch. A sudden rush of memories overwhelmed him. Maggie, younger, standing in the same mirror-filled room. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man Ethan had never seen before, yet felt deeply familiar. "Promise me," Maggie whispered. "Promise me you'll never open it." The man hesitated, staring at the largest mirror in the room. "It's the only way to keep them safe." "No, Maggie. This will only bury the truth deeper." The memory dissolved, leaving Ethan breathless. Who was the man? And what was he trying to stop Maggie from doing? Ethan blinked, disoriented. The memory had felt real, more vivid than a dream. Am I remembering this, or creating it, he wondered. He didn't know what was real anymore. The mirrors, the voices, even the scent of roses. Were they tricks of this place or echoes of the past? Or perhaps both. Driven by equal parts fear and curiosity, Ethan stepped forward. The mirror didn't shatter, it rippled. He was falling. But not into darkness. Into light. Ethan landed on solid ground, coughing as dust swirled around him. He was in a different room now, larger but equally suffocating. Stone walls loomed high, covered in tangled roots and thorny vines. At the center stood a pedestal. On it lay the key. But the key wasn't what caught his attention. It was the circle of portraits surrounding it. Family portraits. Each face was familiar, but disturbingly altered. The eyes of each family member were gouged out, leaving empty, black voids. His own portrait was there too. The eyes were intact, but the mouth was missing. Beneath his portrait, words were crudely carved. "Speak, and you are lost." Ethan reached for the key, but a soft sob stopped him. He turned to see Eleanor, huddled in the corner, her face hidden in her hands. "Help me, Ethan." Her voice trembled. But something was off. Eleanor's figure flickered, like a poorly tuned image. Her sobbing became rhythmic, almost rehearsed. And then she spoke again, but her voice deepened unnaturally. "Help me, Ethan." Exactly the same words. Same tone. Over and over. A recording. Ethan stepped back, realization dawning. This wasn't Eleanor. It never had been. A sudden crack split the air. The mirror behind the false Eleanor fractured violently. Through the shards, Ethan glimpsed the study upstairs. Maggie sat at her desk, calmly writing. But then she stopped. Slowly, deliberately, she looked up. Directly at him. And smiled. What if the real prison was never the house, but the promises we couldn't keep? Ethan's breath caught in his throat as Maggie's smile stretched unervingly through the fractured mirror. The thin crack running through the glass seemed to pulse, as if alive. Her eyes, sharp, deliberate, pierced through the reflection, making it impossible to tell if she was watching him now or if this was a remnant of the past. But one thing was certain. She knew he was here. And she was waiting. The key on the pedestal shimmered under the flickering candlelight. Its intricate design was hauntingly familiar. Delicate vines wrapped around its handle, almost mirroring the thorny ones suffocating the walls. Ethan hesitated, remembering the gouged-out eyes in the family portraits and the ominous inscription beneath his own. "Speak, and you are lost." But something else caught his attention now. The walls. Beneath the tangled roots and vines, faint carvings emerged. Messages. Some etched so deeply they cracked the stone. "Forgive me, Margaret. It wasn't supposed to end this way. The key is not the answer." Each word seemed to bleed with regret, carved in desperation. But one stood out, freshly scratched. "The cost is blood." A cold draft swept through the chamber, carrying the scent of decayed roses and something older. Mold, damp stone, and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron. The flickering light of the candles cast monstrous shadows against the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. In the eerie stillness, Ethan heard it. Soft, slow drip. He turned. At the base of the pedestal, a dark stain crept outward, pooling slowly. Blood. But it wasn't fresh. It oozed thickly from beneath the stone, seeping through invisible cracks. How long had it been bleeding? A sudden rush of images assaulted Ethan's mind. A man, possibly the same figure from the previous visions, stood in this very room, gripping the same key. His hands trembled. "It's the only way," he whispered to Maggie, who stood in the shadows. Maggie didn't move. Her face was unreadable. "You promised," she hissed. The man hesitated, then drove the key into the pedestal. A violent shudder rocked the room. Screams echoed. Voices Ethan couldn't recognize but somehow knew were family. Blood oozed from the stone. And Maggie. She was smiling. The vision shattered, leaving Ethan gasping. Ethan staggered back, the memory, or was it an illusion? Lingering like a fog. His hands shook. Was that real, he questioned himself. Or is this house twisting my mind? Doubt gnawed at him. The house was blurring the line between memory and manipulation. Was Maggie truly the orchestrator of all this? Or was she merely another victim? His mind reeled, but he couldn't afford hesitation. A loud crack snapped Ethan back to the present. The mirror behind him fractured further, the shards shifting unnaturally. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement, figures pacing behind the glass, silhouettes of family members he couldn't fully recognize. Their faces were blurred, their mouths moving in silent screams. And then all at once they stopped, turned, and stared directly at him. The pressure in the room intensified. The air grew heavier, colder. Ethan's every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. The key gleamed, still resting on the bloodied pedestal. It was the only way forward. Ethan reached for the key, fingers hovering above it. The vines carved into its handle seemed to shift under the candlelight, almost moving. The pedestal itself bore faint etchings beneath the key, nearly obscured by the dried blood. To turn is to bind. To break is to bleed. He stared at the inscription, mind racing. What does it bind? And what bleeds if it's broken? The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Whatever this key unlocked, it wouldn't be a door. The distant sound of soft crying reached his ears. Eleanor. But this time the sobbing was different. It wasn't mechanical, nor did it loop unnaturally. It was real, vain, desperate. "Ethan, please." He spun around, eyes searching the dark. The voice was close, just beyond the shadows. But the mirror remained cracked, reflecting only the empty room. Or so he thought. In the farthest corner, barely visible, was Eleanor. Bloodied. Her lips trembled, but her eyes were filled with terror, staring at something behind Ethan. He turned slowly. Nothing. Only the mirror. But in its fractured reflection, a hand hovered inches from his shoulder. He lunged forward, grabbing the key, and the entire room seemed to exhale. The candles extinguished in an instant. Darkness swallowed everything. A whisper slithered through the cold air. "You've turned it once before. Will you do it again?" The pedestal cracked, and the floor beneath Ethan's feet gave way. How far must one fall before realizing they were already in the abyss? Ethan's scream was swallowed by the darkness as he plummeted through the gaping hole beneath him. The icy air tore at his skin, and for a moment, it felt like he would fall forever. The suffocating blackness stretched endlessly, void of light or sound, until pain radiated through his body as he hit the cold, unyielding ground. Groaning, he rolled onto his back, gasping for breath. Above him, the hole had vanished. No trace of the room, the pedestal, or the key remained. Only darkness and silence, except for the distant sound of something breathing. As his eyes adjusted, faint glimmers of light began to reveal his surroundings. The ground was uneven, scattered with broken shards of glass and decaying paper. Ethan picked up a fragment of glass, its surface clouded with age, and saw something etched into it. "Do not awaken what sleeps." The words sent a chill through him. Dropping the shard, his foot bumped against something solid. Looking down, he saw a small wooden box, old and cracked, with a single name carved crudely into the lid. Eleanor. But it wasn't Eleanor's handwriting. It was Maggie's. The air grew colder as Ethan moved deeper into the underground chamber. Thick, damp walls seemed to close in, slick with moisture and covered in sprawling black moss. Strange, indecipherable symbols were carved into the stone, half erased by time. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows twisting unnaturally. A soft scraping sound echoed behind him. He spun, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Yet the air felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching and waiting. Without warning, Ethan was slammed by another flash of memory. A man stood in this very corridor, clutching the same wooden box. His breath was ragged, his face pale. Maggie's voice echoed in the darkness. "You said you'd protect her. But you can't even protect yourself." The man fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His shadow stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting into a monstrous form. The vision shattered. Ethan staggered back, gasping. Who was he? The question gnawed at him, but there was no answer. Only the suffocating dark. Ethan's grip tightened around the box. Was any of this real? The voices, the visions, were they memories? Or fabrications? Was Maggie orchestrating these images? Or were they his own suppressed fears? A flicker of doubt seeped in. What if Eleanor was never here? The thought nearly broke him. But then, why the box? Why her name? I can't trust this place, but I have to keep moving. The narrow corridor opened into a cavernous chamber. Towering stone pillars rose into the shadows above, each carved with names. Family names. Names Ethan recognized. Daniel, Margaret, Eleanor, and his own. At the far end of the chamber stood a massive door, sealed with iron chains. In its center, a handprint was scorched into the stone, blackened and burned deep. Next to it, faint words scratched into the stone. The price has been paid. Will you pay it again? And below that, in fresh blood, one must stay for one to leave. A distant hollow scream echoed from behind the door. Eleanor. The stone pillars surrounding Ethan were adorned with broken mirrors, each one reflecting distorted, fragmented versions of himself. Some faces stared back with hollow eyes, others smiled cruelly. One reflection, however, wasn't his at all. It was Maggie. standing still, watching. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped. But Ethan understood. It's always been you. He turned back to the sealed door, realization dawning. The handprint. It was waiting for him. Ethan approached the door slowly, heart hammering. The box in his hand grew unbearably heavy. Is this the key? But as he hesitated, another noise came. Whispers from the dark. Don't trust her. She lies. Break the box. Open it, and you'll doom us all. The voices swirled around him, contradicting, overlapping. Ethan's grip trembled. Was the box the answer or the curse? Every instinct screamed to throw it into the shadows. But Eleanor's scream, raw and terrified, pierced through the noise. He made his choice. Ethan pressed his hand against the scorched imprint. The door trembled. Chains rattled and snapped, one by one. But before it opened, a whisper slithered behind him. You opened the wrong door. The stone split, and Ethan was pulled into blinding light. What if saving her means losing yourself? Ethan's vision blurred as the blinding light consumed him. His limbs felt weightless, as though his body was suspended between worlds. When the light finally dimmed, he was no longer standing in the cold, damp catacombs. He was in a grand hall, impossibly vast, cloaked in an eerie golden glow. Walls stretched endlessly in every direction, their surfaces covered in countless mirrors. Tall, thin, cracked, pristine, each reflecting distorted versions of Ethan and people he barely recognized. But the silence was oppressive. Too still. Too intentional. Then a soft echo broke the stillness. Ethan. It was Eleanor's voice. Barely a whisper, but it clawed at him like a scream. Ethan moved cautiously, the sound of his footsteps muted by the sheer emptiness. Each mirror he passed seemed to ripple as though its surface was water. He caught glimpses, fleeting and unsettling, of scenes he didn't understand. A boy no older than 6, holding hands with a woman whose face was shrouded in shadow. Eleanor, standing motionless, her reflection smudged and fractured. Maggie, younger and smiling, holding the same wooden box Ethan carried. At the base of one mirror, scratched hastily into the golden floor, were the words, "The closer you look, the less you'll see." But it was the reflection directly ahead that rooted Ethan in place. It wasn't his own. The figure in the mirror mimicked Ethan's movements but felt off. Its face was softer, its eyes darker. It smiled. Ethan did not. Slowly, the figure in the glass raised its hand and traced a single word onto the fogged mirror. Trade. A cold wind snaked through the hall, though there were no windows, no doors, only mirrors. Then the glass of the nearest mirror cracked, just slightly, but loud enough to echo. Ethan flinched. Another crack. Then another. The fractures began to weave intricate patterns across the mirrors, like veins crawling toward him. The cracks triggered a sudden surge of fragmented memories. A hand grasping his shoulder. Maggie's voice. We all must give something, Ethan. Even you. A flash of Eleanor weeping. Please don't listen to her. A glimpse of himself, older, colder, locking a door and whispering. This is the only way. Ethan stumbled forward, gasping. These weren't just memories. They were possibilities. The hall seemed to stretch further the more he moved. Was he walking in circles? The mirrors whispered things he couldn't be sure were real. She was gone long before you arrived. You left her, Ethan. Just like they all did. You're not the hero here. His grip tightened on the box. Whoa, this is real. I'm here for her. But even his own voice sounded uncertain. Was he here to save Eleanor? Or to sacrifice her? The whispers sharpened into voices. Then screams. The mirrors around him trembled violently. Ethan turned in every direction, but the reflections began to change. No longer just fractured images, but scenes unfolding. Eleanor pounding on glass, screaming silently for help. Maggie standing over a crib, cradling something wrapped in dark cloth. A man, a stranger yet familiar, staring back at Ethan, bleeding from his eyes. Then the floor quaked. The mirrors began to shatter. From the shards emerged dark, twisting forms, shadowy figures, their limbs jagged like broken glass. They moved slowly at first, crawling toward Ethan. Each figure wore a mask, carved with the faces of people Ethan knew. Daniel, Eleanor, Maggie, even himself. One figure leaned in, its cracked mask smiling. Trade. Ethan realized the wooden box was vibrating in his hands. Without thinking, he opened it. The box was empty, or so it seemed. But when Ethan peered deeper, he saw it wasn't empty at all. Inside was a single blackened key. Its surface pulsed faintly as though alive. But as his fingers touched it, pain shot through his hand. He dropped the key, and where it landed, the ground split open. A stairway spiraled downward, carved from the same dark stone as the catacombs. But just as Ethan moved to descend, the whispers changed. Not everything below can be brought back. You're not the first to try. Could this be another trap? Another manipulation? But Eleanor's scream shattered the hesitation. Ethan took the first step down. The stairwell seemed endless, spiraling into darker and darker depths. The shadows thickened, and the air grew colder. At the bottom, faint light flickered. A figure sat slumped against the wall. Eleanor. But as he stepped closer, the figure lifted its head. It wasn't Eleanor. It was him. Older. Haggard. Smiling. I told you this was the only way. How far would you go to save someone who no longer remembers you? Ethan stood frozen, staring at the older version of himself slumped against the cold stone wall. His own eyes stared back, hollow, defeated, yet disturbingly satisfied. The older Ethan chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that echoed in the suffocating darkness. I warned you, didn't I? The younger Ethan tightened his grip on the box, the key still warm in his palm. Who are you? Ethan demanded, though he knew the answer. The older Ethan tilted his head. I'm what's left when you give up. The older Ethan gestured lazily toward the corridor behind him, where shadows twisted unnaturally. She's waiting, but it's not the Eleanor you remember. Ethan's breath quickened. The whispers around him grew louder, swirling through the darkness. Faint voices overlapped, impossible to understand, but all undeniably familiar. Eleanor's faint laughter, distorted and distant. Maggie's cold whisper. Not every door should be opened. Daniel's angry shout. You were warned. Ahead, the corridor split in two. One path descended deeper into blackness, the other bathed in a flickering crimson glow. Scratched into the stone between the paths were jagged words. One saves, one destroys. Choose wisely. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like iron. Ethan glanced at his older self, but the figure only smiled wider. It doesn't matter which you choose. You'll end up here. The oppressive silence that followed seemed to close in around him. The stone walls, slick with moisture, seemed to breathe. Somewhere far ahead, Ethan swore he heard Eleanor's voice. Help me. But was it real? Ethan blinked, and the darkness fractured into fleeting images. Eleanor sitting alone in the garden, her hair tangled with dying roses. Maggie standing at the foot of Eleanor's bed, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear. His own reflection in a cracked mirror, bleeding from the eyes. Each vision lasted only a heartbeat, but they clawed at Ethan's mind, warping his sense of reality. Was any of this real? Or was he already too deep to know? You're not thinking clearly, his older self crooned. You believe this is about Eleanor. But it's always been about you. Ethan shook his head violently. Oh. I'm here to save her. Save her. The older Ethan laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You're here to finish what Maggie started. You just don't see it yet. The ground seemed to shift beneath him. Could that be true? Had he been manipulated all along? The box in his hands vibrated, a subtle hum that set his teeth on edge. Every second felt like an eternity. The shadows around him twisted more violently now, clawing at the edges of the light. Choose. The older Ethan's voice was softer now, almost pitying. But know this, whatever you pick, it's already too late. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He stared down both paths. The darkness on the left seemed endless, but the crimson light on the right pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, clear as day, Eleanor's voice echoed from the dark corridor. Ethan, please. But from the crimson-lit path came another voice. His own. Turn back. Ethan's eyes caught something carved into the stone near the dark path. What is lost can be found, but not unchanged. And near the crimson path, some doors cannot be closed. The box in his hand grew heavier. Slowly, it creaked open on its own, revealing the blackened key. Yet this time, something else glimmered beneath it. A small, silver locket. Eleanor's locket. But when Ethan opened it, it didn't contain her picture. It was empty. Or worse, waiting to be filled. Ethan hesitated. What if this was a trick? Maggie had manipulated them all before. Was this path truly leading to Eleanor, or deeper into Maggie's twisted game? The older Ethan leaned forward. There's no right answer. Only consequences. Ethan gritted his teeth. Maybe for you. Not for me. Without another word, Ethan stepped toward the darkness, clutching the locket. The shadows swallowed him whole. Each step echoed louder than the last. The air growing colder, heavier. Then silence. Ahead, a faint figure appeared. Eleanor. She stood motionless, her white dress torn, her face obscured by tangled hair. Eleanor, Ethan whispered. Her head slowly turned. But the face wasn't Eleanor's. It was Maggie's, smiling. You chose wrong. The ground cracked beneath him, and Ethan plummeted into the abyss.